Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had overhaul quirk part 2. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 3, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Crazy_Texan_Productions from AO3. So let's start the video. Izuku took a peek at the paperwork on the desk Murray was sitting at, only for his hair to blind him as it was ruffled by the man. The hand moved back up into Murray's own hair, and he leaned over the files, his pen slowly but surely filling in the various forms. Izuku watched Aizawa refill Murray's coffee before the raven-haired man picked him up. Aizawa lightly dropped him onto the couch, and the man sat down next to him. Aizawa-sensei, Izuku held onto his arm. I'm bored. The man grunted and looked at his phone. He seemed to look at the time before speaking. Want to go annoy Hisashi? Izuku smiled. He liked the man's reactions. Yes. Let's go. With that, the two headed towards the door, and only the sound of the door closing made Murray realize that they were gone. The Sasaki stretched out his arms and legs while remaining seated, the back of the chair moving with him. That became his downfall when the door slamming open spooked him into tipping over. He groaned in slight pain and looked towards the hallway to the door, just in time to see Izuku run in holding something. I found a cat that looks like a bobcat. Izuku showed off the small kitten to Murray. It was white with a gray face, paws, and a tail that was bobbed. It's a boy. Just old enough to be away from mom. Not feral yet. Shouta was by the door, holding Izuku's coat. Murray stood up and rubbed the back of his head. The kitten was curled up in Izuku's hold. It was cute to say the least. Izuku was giving Murray a look that made him think that the kid looked like a puppy begging for food. You can keep it, but, Izuku smiled, and the look somewhat disappeared off his face in place of an upset one. It has to get along with Buttercup, and she has to get along with it. Almost immediately after saying that, Izuku bolted off to find his dog, calling out her name. You're weak to puppy dog eyes. Shouta spoke. Murray was certain a smile was hidden under the man's capture weapon. Says the one who was on his side. Not really, I just like cats. Shouta silently chuckled at the tired look that immediately spread onto Murray's face. Tilda. Okay, now put your current full name here in your best handwriting. Murray pointed at a dotted line, Izuku's pen slowly writing out his name. And then your new one here. So instead of Chizaki, write Sasaki. The small boy smiled as he wrote his name into the line. And we're done. I'll go turn this in so you two stay here. Murray stood up and gathered the paper into a folder, then placed the folder into a briefcase. I'll be back as fast I can. You two, don't set the house on fire. Murray then left the house and locked the door behind him. Aizawa waved Murray off from his spot on the couch, the kitten curled up in his scarf and purring up a storm. Izuku let out a yawn as he stretched out his arms above his head. Shouta joined in soon after. He shuffled around on the couch before he found a somewhat comfortable position. Izuku went down the hall to his room and grabbed his blanket, bundling it up in his arms. He then walked to the couch and got onto the side of the couch that wasn't occupied by his teacher. Tilda Murray set his keys down quietly as he took his shoes off and closed the door. He locked it and placed his briefcase by the door for later. He walked into the living room and smiled at the scene he saw. Izuku was curled up on one half of the couch, blanket wrapped around himself tightly. A white moving ball of fur nestled into the massive green curls on his head. Shouta was a mess of limbs. One arm over the back of the couch, the other on the armrest, one leg on the couch while the other hung off it. Both dead asleep. Moving quietly to not wake either of them, he moved to the kitchen to start on lunch for the day. He heard a small meow behind him and looked at the couch. The kitten was on the back of it looking at him. Murray walked over to it and reached out to let it smell his hand. The kitten, however, saw this as an invitation to climb up his arm and lay down on his shoulder. Murray jolted and craned his neck in order to look at the little furball. Guess you're a climber. Want to stay there? Small purrs came out the small body, and Murray moved back to the kitchen. Every now and again, he'd lift up an ingredient and let the small kitten sniff it, getting various reactions ranging from begging to obvious disgust. 10 minutes later, Izuku stirred from his rest and looked towards the smell coming from the kitchen. He slowly untangled himself and yawned. Have a nice rest, sleepyhead? The 8-year-old nodded and moved towards the table as Murray started to set it. That's good. Better than the nightmares. I think my spine is a pretzel now. Murray held back the sudden laugh that threatened to escape him as Shouta sat up and stretched out. The sidekick was holding a hand over his mouth, and had the other keeping the kitten on his shoulder from falling off. Izuku, however, let out his laughter without a care in the world of the repercussions. Judging by Aizawa's glare, he would pay for that in training next week. But he couldn't bring himself to care at the moment. All three were at the table, Izuku listening to stories the adults had, and telling stories about his time at school with Momo and Tenya in turn. Murai was smiling as he drove with Izuku through the countryside. He couldn't help it. Izuku was now legally his son, and the Chisaki siblings had failed to get custody of him. Izuku was happy too, watching the livestock roam the pastures as they passed by. Murai's GPS blinked to life, alerting him to an upcoming turn. Murray followed it, turning his truck onto a dirt road and onto a pasture filled with horses. Huh. Where are we going? This is a friend of mine. Murray spoke honestly. He knew Izuku hated people lying to him, even in little ways. She's a hero like myself. She's going to help you with your quirk analysis. Is there something wrong with it? Izuku sounded a tad hurt. Were his analysis journals written that badly? He thought he was doing good. No. Murai reached over and ruffled Izuku's hair. She's going to teach you more about it, give you tips, and show you how it can be used in everyday life. Izuku let out a noise of realization and waited until they stopped in front of a house. A curly blonde-haired woman was in the front brushing out the fur of a tied-up horse. Getting out of the truck, Izuku walked over. Good afternoon, Monoma. I see you're getting your horse all clean. Murai stood next to him, quickly pulling Izuku back when he tried to walk behind the horse. Ah, Sasaki. The woman looked up at him. You're early. She looked at Izuku with green eyes. And you must be little Izuku. I've heard a bit about you. Izuku smiled and politely bowed his head. It's nice to meet you too, Monoma. The woman moved to picking dirt out of the horse's hooves. I'm Monoma Chimiko, or the analyzing hero, copycat. This is my family's horse farm. My nephew is inside sleeping, so we do have to be a bit quiet. He's actually around your age, isn't that, Monoma? Right. Right. Analysis training. She lifted her head up and smiled. Izuku held back a small giggle at her antics. She was a rambler too. I'm going to be back later today. Stay safe and call me if you need me, okay? Murray knelt down to look Izuku in the eyes. When the boy nodded and gave him a hug, which he returned, he set off to work. He could trust Monoma. Plus, he could easily check in. So why was he feeling so nervous? Tilda Murray made it back to the farm just in time to see Izuku running from a blonde with a lasso. The blonde was most likely the nephew from the looks of it. Chimiko was watching from the porch, smiling. She waved him over when she locked eyes with him. Welcome back, Sasaki. She offered him a soda can, and he took it. It was cold to the touch. They've been playing for the past 10 minutes. Horses are thinking they're crazy. The woman chuckled. How was work? It was fine. How was the lesson? He's a fast learner, but he's also very good at analysis. I might steal him away from you in order to keep him for myself. She bumped her shoulder into his. Murai could hear the mirth in her voice. He smiled and opened his soda. He watched the kids run amok. Nito doesn't make friends easily, so it's nice to see him being a kid. Izuku is similar in a sense. It's a bit harder to gain his trust since he was a toddler, but we're working on it. Murray smiled. The sun was setting and the kids were having fun. Maybe doing this every week wouldn't be too bad. Tilda. Izuku, what happened to your arm? Tenya looked at his friend. A red cast was wrapped around the boy's arm, and a blue sling kept the injured arm to his chest. I tried to do a front flip on my snowboard, and ended up not only failing to rotate enough, but I also landed in shallow snow. Momo tilted her head before reaching into her bag. What are you doing? Grabbing this. The raven-haired girl produced a black marker from her bag. Can we sign your cast? Sure. Izuku watched in confusion as his friends left their names on his cast. What was the point? It was going to be taken off when his arm healed. He looked at the writing and held back a chuckle as Momo left a joke. The laughter brought their classmates over. Hey, Sasaki, can we sign it too? Izuku held his arm to his chest defensively. Tenya and Momo quickly came to his rescue. You can't, but we can do it for you since he trusts us enough that his phobias don't flare up. Momo was quick to the punch. The students all smiled and wrote their messages on a paper Tenya produced, and Momo wrote down what each student wanted. Izuku watched his friends work to make everyone in the room happy. He felt so much better here. He didn't have to fear getting beaten up once a day. His classmates gave him space and didn't care about his quirk until it was brought up in a random conversation a few weeks back. His teachers, while they were similar to his old ones, cared more about his education than his test scores. They gave him his space and let him keep his suppressants on him. He didn't even have to remind one teacher yet. Sure, he had to tell the substitutes, but that was normal. Coming to Sumi was the best decision ever. Izuku believed that wholeheartedly. Eventually, the end of the day arrived, and Izuku and Tenya were picked up by Tensei, waving Momo off as she was also picked up. Mirai was most likely still at work. Thus Izuku would be home alone for a bit. Tensei, after dropping him off at the Sasaki house, signed Izuku's cast as well. Izuku smiled at the man and thanked him for the ride home. He went to the front door and waved bye to the two Edas as he unlocked it with his key. He kicked off his shoes, took Buttercup's vest off, and relocked the door. He texted Murray to tell him that he had made it home and moved to feed the animals. Bobcat, the kitten he had found, was sleeping on top of the computer tower. His sleepy state did nothing to stop him from seemingly instantaneously appearing at his food bowl after hearing the sound of food being poured. Buttercup sat at her bowl until Izuku moved away to let her dig in. Izuku grabbed a snack from the pantry for himself and moved to the living room. Turning on the TV, he moved to a cooking channel. He liked this chef's voice. It was calming and the food always looked good. He wasn't alone for long before Buttercup jumped onto the couch and laid down beside him. And Bobcat joined her soon after, curling up on her back. Izuku absent-mindedly pet her on the head, his bad arm on the armrest. It wasn't until a few hours later that Murray got home. As he passed by the living room, a hand ruffled the younger boy's hair. The two ate a good dinner, said their goodnights, and got into bed. Izuku, however, woke up around midnight. Tears streamed down his cheeks and his breathing was all over the place. Izuku sniffled and felt Buttercup bump his good arm with her nose, so he hugged her close. After calming down, he got up and out of bed. He flinched at the cold floors, but kept walking anyway. He eventually reached Murai's room and walked in. The door wasn't closed, so he could see the man in bed. He gently shook him. Izuku? Murray rolled over to look at him and the clock on his nightstand. It's almost midnight. What's wrong? I had a bad dream. Can I sleep in your bed tonight? Murray paused. Izuku didn't ask for that often. Murray knew it meant he'd had one of his worst nightmares. So he nodded and let Izuku curl up on one side of the large bed in his own blanket. You can always come to me if you feel unsafe, Izuku. I promise that I'll protect you from anything. The boy smiled lightly and burrowed his way into the extra pillows and eventually found his way back to sleep. Murray pet Buttercup a few times before he allowed sleep to reclaim him too well. Murray woke up that morning feeling refreshed. He had the day off today, so he could relax if he wanted to, though he had a nagging feeling that he was forgetting something. He put the thought aside, deciding not to worry about it just then, and glanced towards Izuku, who was curled up in the bed next to him. Buttercup had laid in between them and was staring at him. Hungry? Her tail started to wag. Taking the hint, he got up, grabbed his glasses, and made his way to the kitchen with two animals in tow, one of which was making his hunger known to anyone who'd listen. After pouring the food for both animals, Murray checked the calendar. He cursed under his breath as he realized what he'd forgotten. Today was the day of the party All Might had invited them to. Izuku didn't even have a suit yet. He quickly got dressed and started the shower. He shook Izuku awake and pushed the boy to the bathroom. Izuku was quick to realize the rush and hopped into gear as Murray made a hasty breakfast. They were out the door by 10 in the morning. Murray paused, examining the suits Izuku had liked. They weren't exactly fancy party material. Not only that, but Izuku's fashion sense was just as bad as All Might's sleep schedule. Realizing that he'd need to take charge of picking Izuku's outfit, he quickly went through and picked out a proper suit that would be appropriate for the party. Izuku put the ones he picked back on the shelves, minus one that he liked a lot. They could have it as one he uses for parties that weren't as fancy as this one. Murray showed his selection to Izuku, who picked out a gray suit that Murray noticed looked a bit like the one he used for work. He didn't pay it any mind and put all of the others back on the shelves where they belonged. He had Izuku try them on, found the perfect size in that style, and purchased the two suits. Izuku held the bag happily as they went back to the house to prepare for the night. Izuku let out an annoyed huff as he failed once again to get his tie like Murai's. Then again, he was trying to do it one-handed. The man knelt down and started to fix it as Izuku stood still. "The tie god has cursed you, hasn't he?" Murai joked as he finished up the small tie and clipped it with a small gold clip. "Father could do his tie just fine. Grandpa too." Izuku looked at the tie in the mirror. His hair was slicked back with a gel made for curly hair, so it should stay down for the evening. His face still had plenty of baby fat, but most of it was on his cheeks. Freckles still dotted his cheeks, and he could swear that there were more than the last time he'd looked. Murai paused. This was the first time Izuku directly mentioned Kai since the kidnapping attempt a few months ago. Was Kai finally becoming an afterthought in the back of Izuku's mind? He hoped so. Pushing the thought away for later, Murai stood up. Buttercup let out a small whine. The venue unfortunately didn't allow dogs, and while she technically didn't count as a pet, Izuku was okay with leaving her home to avoid having people trying to pet her or get her out of the venue. Murai scratched behind her ears and rubbed his thumbs on her temples. Better not make a mess on the carpet. She hadn't done it since she was a puppy, but he'd prefer not to come home to a mess. Buttercup responded by licking his hand. "Thank you." Murai heard Izuku giggle behind him. He looked at the time on his watch and nodded. It was time to go. "Come, Izuku, we have to meet All Might first." Izuku marveled at the venue. There were high-ranking heroes everywhere. Murai led him to a roped-off area where kids his age were. There was a table with food and drinks on, people to give servings out, and various things to keep them out of trouble while the adults partied. Izuku's dual-colored eyes locked onto his friends, and he ran over, waving a quick goodbye to Murai. Izuku quickly hugged Tenya and Momo tightly. Tenya had a suit much like Izuku, only it was in a shade of blue Izuku hadn't seen before. It wasn't baby blue, but it seemed to be a dark faded blue. Tenya's hair was brushed back and didn't have any gel in it. The perks of having straight hair, Izuku supposed. The boy quickly hugged him back. Momo was wearing a red dress with white edges. There was a white lily in her hair. She had on clip-on earrings. Izuku almost wanted to ask her why she didn't have her ears pierced. He did. Then again, Murai did say it was usually associated with Yakuza groups. But that was only one ear, not both. He had both of his ears pierced. Then again, he might have originally only had one and someone got the other done too. "Izuku, you're mumbling." Momo spoke softly, smiling. Her hands folded in front of her. Tenya had his hands at his sides. "Oh, sorry," Izuku smiled shyly before pausing. He saw someone with eyes like his, so he quickly ran over to the boy, ignoring Tenya's small weight. The boy's hair was split down the center into red and white. He had a burn scar over his left eye, which was blue. Meanwhile, his left was gray. He looked surprised and worried when Izuku waved to him. "Hi, you have eyes like mine." Izuku pointed to his own eyes, then the boy's. He looked confused and worried still. Maybe he was shy? "I'm Sasaki, Izuku. What's your name?" "Shouto. What did I say before we left the house?" Izuku looked up at the voice and froze. Endeavor was glaring down at him. Only Izuku didn't see the number 2 hero. He saw his father in his place. He wasn't at the party anymore, he was in the lab. Izuku let out a scream and bolted until he saw a familiar green-headed man, who quickly knelt down and held the small 8-year-old, who was hiding his face in his shoulder. Endeavor followed him close, earning a glare from Murai. Should have known he was the son of a lowly sidekick. Endeavor glared back. "The boy needs to learn his place as your son. And you," Murai let the venom in his voice be present, "should learn not to scare children." Number 2. Murai made eye contact with the kid behind Endeavor. "I hope your children aren't scared of their own father." Endeavor looked ready to say something when he took in the scene around him. Reporters and other heroes were whispering amongst themselves. He didn't need to have a meeting with the Hero Commission over a damn kid, so he turned and left. Shouto followed close behind. What was his problem? He was just being a kid. All Might spoke from behind Murai. Murai simply found a spot away from people and the noise to calm his son down. Izuku was slow to calm down, but was getting there. The snacks and water All Might brought helped a lot. "Izuku," Murai's hand on Izuku's head. "What happened?" "He looked like father did. Both heroes had their breath stolen from them. Before he hit me." Izuku buried his face in Murai's chest. The man simply held him close until he was eventually calm enough to go back to his friends. By time he did, Tenya and Momo had snagged a spot for them to rest for the rest of the night. The two quickly hugged him and kept him company the rest of the night, talking about anything that came to mind. Tenya was going to be an older brother. Momo was getting better at her quirk, and Izuku's cast was drawn on by himself and his friends. Cats, dogs, and small doodles of heroes were added amongst the signatures from his classmates. Momo eventually made a hairband and started to braid Izuku's hair, the gel helping her keep it contained in the single braid that she was making. Izuku tugged his head away whenever asked. Tenya watched, wanting to learn in case his new sibling was a sister. Eventually, the party started to die down and Izuku was carried to the car by Night-Eye. He waved goodbye to Tenya and Momo over his dad's shoulder before letting the cold mistress of sleep wash over him in the comforts of Mirai's hold. He felt safe and warm. Chimiko sat by herself in a private booth at a bar, waiting for Mirai to arrive. It was a casual get-together, and she was in a baggy hoodie and old sweatpants with no makeup or anything like that. She was of the opinion that it was a waste of time and product to put on cosmetics, just to take it off an hour later, and it's not like they were going on a date. After flashing her hero license to the bartender, she activated her quirk, creating a shield around the booth to block any adventurous people from trying to hit on her. She was tired from work and wanted some time alone until Mirai arrived. He arrived only a few minutes after her drink. As she saw him, she lowered the shield blocking the door to let the sidekick in. The sidekick who looked like he'd gotten run over by a car, just without the injuries. Jesus Christ, Sasaki. Chimiko stood up and moved to sit down next to him. The man leaned on her. What's wrong? I've never seen you this disheveled before. Izuku's the grandson of All Might's early hero years teacher, like his high school years. Chimiko had her eyes widen. Before she could respond, he continued. And Izuku's the last one left alive in that family tree. Her heart ached. Murray straightened up from his slump and turned to look at her, a grim expression on his face. I feel like if I tell him, he'd blame himself for not checking in on the son of his master, and thus not preventing their deaths. Murray stole her drink. You had everyone in your family die, except you and your nephew, right? How'd you deal with it? Chimiko paused for a bit. Yes, she did have her parents die when she was young. Her older brother raised her, and once she got on her feet, she went off on her own, but stayed in contact. Then her brother and sister-in-law died in a car accident and left their son, Nito, an orphan. So she returned the favor and is raising her nephew. Stealing back her drink, but ordering 2 more, she finally turned to him. Sasaki, I'm not All Might. I know. She held her hand over his mouth and continued speaking. So I can't say for certain what his reaction will be. But for me, her hand moved to her chest. I was involved with my brother and his family. He raised me. My situation is very different compared to All Might's. What you need to do is rip the band-aid off. It's not going to be that easy. And you think it was easy for me to tell my 7-year-old nephew why his parents weren't coming home from the hospital? Why he had to come live with me? She placed a friendly hand on Mirai's shoulder. Being the bearer of bad news is never easy, but it's kinda what we signed up for as heroes, even if we're low-ranking. She downed the rest of her drink. Murray let out a small chuckle at her little friendly jab. He supposed she was right. The waiter brought over the other drinks, after carting Murray, and then left the two to drink in peace. I'm glad I can talk to you, Chimiko. Shouta is I called you by your given name. My bad. She waved a hand at him. I don't mind it. Never was one for formalities. And that's why you can't keep a job. Murray smiled as her cheeks went red. Oi. He couldn't hide the snort he made even if he was sober. Murray left the bar with Chimiko a few hours later. He was much more relaxed, but still sober enough to think. He walked here since it was close, so he gently grabbed Chimiko. You want to crash at my place? Chimiko smiled and leaned towards him. My. She held her chin. Making a move, Sasaki. Murray's face went beet red. No. He held his hands up in front of him, letting go of her wrist. I meant to sleep. My house is nearby, and I don't like the idea of you walking home by yourself. Plus, I'm not really looking for romantic relationships, since raising Izuku takes up a lot of my time. He heard Chimiko snort as she lightly punched his shoulder, stopping his rambling. I'm kidding. Her smile was infectious. So sure. I'll probably have Nito brought there too. Have the boys hang out, and to not raise suspicion on why I'm there in case the press sees. Good foresight. Was that a fucking pun? Murray smiled at her as they started walking. Chimiko called her babysitter and gave him the address as they walked. Once the call was over, they talked amongst themselves about how their boys were, exchanging parenting tips they'd learned. They beat the babysitter there by a few minutes, and thus waited outside for him. Once he arrived, they went inside to escape the cold air. Izuku looked over the couch as Murray, Nito, and Chimiko came in. He smiled and invited the blonde to come watch movies with him, who happily rushed over and hopped onto the couch. Murray and Chimiko got a snack and water from the kitchen. Murray heard a loud scream, followed by two other more high-pitched ones. Chimiko jolted up right beside him, and the two realized they were in the same bed. Murray quickly lifted the sheets and breathed a sigh of relief at the fact that they were both still fully clothed. The sheet was quickly flattened when two small bodies leapt onto it and practically tackled the adults. The boys were spooked by a horror movie, if the sounds of the TV were any hint. "Monoma, could you turn off the TV?" Murray spoke as he rubbed Izuku's back. She nodded and got out of his bed to go do so, leaving him with two panicked 9-year-olds, one of which was twice as scared when Chimiko left. Chimiko returned with extra blankets and pillows, and with a wave of her hand all three boys levitated as she made a nice little bed for it and slowly set them all in before getting in herself. Nito quickly latched onto her while Izuku kept his ear to Murray's chest. The adults were facing each other with the kids between them, a soft blanket laid over them. Mom and Hari sometimes did this. Izuku spoke softly as Murray used his thumbs to wipe away the small amount of tears in his son's eyes. "My parents always slept in the same bed." Nito buried his face in his aunt's arm. Murray saw Chimiko's face turn red in the darkness of the room. He, however, slowly realized what Izuku had said. His mother and godfather sometimes slept in the same bed. Was Izuku's mother cheating on her husband with his godfather? Murray woke up that morning feeling surprisingly refreshed. Then he froze as he suddenly realized that he wasn't alone. He gazed at the two kids and woman in his bed, frozen with surprise for a few seconds. Chimiko's blonde hair was laid next to him, much like her nephew's, and Izuku's green head of hair, like Murray's, was on his other side. Her eyes were green like Izuku's. Nito had blue eyes. They almost looked like a family. He realized suddenly that felt okay with that mental image, and stayed in place watching the kids sleep. His trance was broken when Chimiko woke up abruptly. She blinked a couple of times to clear the sleep from her eyes before looking at him. "I'm okay." Her voice was rough, like her throat was dry. She rubbed her eyes gently. Murray got up as she nestled back into the bed, an arm draped over the boys protectively. "You have work today?" "No, but Izuku, and by extension Nito, have school." With a nod, she stayed there a little bit longer before getting up and out of bed. "Think you can drop me and Nito off at my house then?" "My friend dropped me off at the bar, so my car's at home." Murray nodded and got his keys. Izuku blinked as he was dropped off at Chimiko's house. Murray knelt down in front of him. "Izuku, I have to go to work, and I won't be able to come home for a while. So you can't stay at home. Monoma will protect you. I promise. Aizawa will still be coming here for your training, but you won't see me for a while, okay?" His face was serious and Chimiko held Izuku's shoulders. "Okay," Izuku pouted lightly. He hugged Murray tightly. "Promise you'll come back though." "I promise." Murray let in a breath of air and coughed violently. The person next to him had a hand on his shoulder as he coughed. Where was he? Where was Izuku? Where's All Might? Why were his ears ringing? Looking around, he saw flames and destruction. People running around, some on fire, kids screaming for their parents, parents screaming for their children. "Sir Nightai, you need to help evacuate the town." That was All Might's voice. "He's here." Izuku had been walking in the town with Aizawa when an explosion went off in the distance. His teacher told him to stay with people and called Monoma to pick him up as he took off towards it. He quickly took shelter in an ice cream parlor and texted his analysis teacher what Aizawa had done and what had happened. She was quick to respond that she was going to pick him up, so he waited for her. A tall man came up to him. "Are you lost?" "No, I'm waiting for my mom." He didn't want to tell the stranger that Monoma was his teacher. He looked at the man and paused at his familiar looks. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man. His hair was white and curly. His eyes a red hue. He was wearing a black suit with a white undershirt, but no tie. He had very sharp features. I see. Would you like an ice cream while you wait for your mother? Izuku shook his head, looking out the window for Monoma's car. He didn't like this man. Thank you for being polite. Mind if I keep you company then? Izuku bolted outside the second her car parked across the street. He was halfway across when the man grabbed him by his ponytail and yanked him back. His hands flew to his head at the pain in his scalp. You're just like him. Izuku was certain he wasn't supposed to hear that. Izuku, cover your ears. A feminine voice, Chimiko's voice. Her quirk. He quickly slapped his hands over his ears. He still heard the loud shriek that broke windows, but the man behind let him go in order to cover his ears while groaning in pain. Izuku bolted to her and latched on. She was glaring, but he could see red in her ears. She was bleeding. Chimiko's quirk, takeaway, allowed her to copy quirks if she analyzed them to a certain extent. She suffered from headaches if she used her own quirk too long, alongside any of the drawbacks of the quirk she copies. Sensei, my quirk, use it. Izuku shook her arms lightly. He wasn't allowed to use his. He didn't have a license. She did. She quickly caught the hint and stomped her foot into the ground. A wall of asphalt formed in front of them. She then took off running with him. Izuku ran behind her, holding onto her hand. Izuku, run in front of me. He wants you more than me. Izuku followed the command, but stopped when they reached a dead end. The power to copy a quirk. Now that is interesting. They both froze at the voice and turned. Izuku saw Chimiko move in front of him. But it obviously has its drawbacks based on the blood in your ears. Who are you and what do you want? The man chuckled and held a hand up towards them. I suppose that since you're going to die, I'll tell you. Izuku placed his hand against the wall. Sometimes rules needed to be broken. I am called All for One. This is one of those times. Izuku pulled Chimiko to the ground and through the wall. He let out a loud howl of pain as a brick landed on his leg. He grabbed it and chucked it towards the villain chasing them. Chimiko picked him up and bolted once more. She was faster than before. 3 quirks, 10-minute limit. Chimiko kept running, focusing on her speed and breathing. He talked like she should know him. Was Mirai connected to him? Either way, she promised to protect Izuku. Ringing filled her ears as an explosion knocked her over, and she curled around Izuku protectively. She'd promised him. All for One rubbed his head. That kid had guts to throw a brick at him. His hand pulled back with some blood on it. Lovely. The woman had already left, but he knew where she was heading. Heroes were so predictable, after all. He casually used a quirk to cause an explosion in a building she ran past. The result was the annoyance getting thrown into a building at high speeds and not getting back up. He started to make his way over when he heard something that reminded him of a bigger annoyance. I am here. The ground shook when the hero landed. The air twisted when he threw the first punch. Time slowed for All Might when All for One caught his fist. Izuku's everything hurt, but he felt warm and safe. A hand gently ran through his hair. He wanted to look at who, but his eyes refused to stay open. He heard screaming, ringing, coughing, crying. Everything. Izuku, Chimiko, Dad. The world went black again. All Might saw Night Eye run towards the two, but froze when the villain snapped his fingers and another building exploded, cutting off his view of his sidekick. He growled and slammed a fist into All for One's side. The man simply smiled and disappeared with another quirk. Toshinori quickly ran to where Mirai had been and froze. 3 Imps had made it to them first, tending to the 3, and, to his shock, were performing CPR on his sidekick's son. After a few long moments watching the Imps, Toshinori breathed a sigh of relief as Izuku let out a gasp as his breathing was restored. He let out a pain-filled sob as he was moved onto a stretcher. As he was moved, he started to try and call out for Mirai and his mother. Mirai was still unresponsive. The sidekick's glasses were shattered beyond any hope of repair, and he had more than a couple burns. Chimiko likewise remained unconscious, and was the next to be taken away. Finally, Mirai stirred back to consciousness and coughed violently as air filled his lungs. All Might consulted with the Imp that had been attending to the sidekick before he turned his attention back to Night Eye. Sir Night Eye, you need to help evacuate the town. All Might's voice was filled with worry and rage. He's here. He watched Mirai piece it together, then nod and set to work helping the Imps. He launched into the air to try and locate All for One again. Why had he targeted Izuku? Was he after his quirk? If so, Did Izuku still have his quirk? He caught a glimpse of the supervillain and immediately set out to kill the monster, and drew his fist back for a smash. Tilda Nightai helped organize the heroes and emergency responders, sending them to where they were most needed. Water-based heroes to the areas on fire, rescue heroes to the civilians who needed help, and EMTs to the injured. He knew Chimiko and Izuku were safe. He'd been told by the EMT who tended to him that they were going to the hospital for their injuries, and said EMT was even sticking by him, making sure he was all right. He wondered how All Might was faring as the last of the civilians were saved, and he was the last to be evacuated. He felt like something bad was about to happen. All Might held his left side tightly. He could taste blood in his mouth. He looked up at All for One, who was smiling happily. You did all of that for nothing. Now here you lay, a broken man, with only that hand keeping you from having your guts painting the road. And for what? Your master? All Might jolted. I bet she's rolling in her grave. Oh wait. All for One held his chin as he remembered. There isn't enough of her left to roll. The man howled with laughter as he turned away and started to walk away. Now I have to track down that boy again? All Might's eyes widened. Izuku. No. He refused to let All for One get near the last part of his master's family. With a pained grunt, All Might stood up and moved his hand away from his side. He hoped his costume would help keep his entrails inside of his torso as he powered up and rushed All for One. All for One. The man turned to look at him, a look of horror on his face, and All Might's fist connected with the man's head. Murray ran through the halls of the hospital, ignoring the nurses and doctors shouting after him for doing so. He knew Izuku was okay, that Chimiko was okay, but there was one other person he needed to check up on. Murray quickly found his destination and ran to the bedside of All Might, his boss, his hero. All Might was connected to several machines and wasn't even awake. Murray's hand bumped into his arm, and he broke the promise he made. All Might needed to live. Izuku sneezed out ash into the tissue the nurse was holding in front of his face. A second one treating the burns on his back. The nurse gently rubbed his nose with a second tissue while telling him what she was doing. He was okay with the touches, but only because it was to help him get better. He heard the door open and saw Murray enter. He smiled before having to sneeze again. He's got something stuck in his nose, and I'm trying to get it out like this so we don't have to do surgery. Izuku sneezed again. Murray pulled up a chair. What do you think it is? Ash, possible debris, anything could be in there. Another sneeze. There it is. Feel better, kiddo? The woman smiled at him and offered a tissue. She showed Murray and Izuku what had come out. A bunch of ash, small shards of debris, and some blood. Murray looked at Izuku, who was now laying down with bandages around his waist and chest. The nurses left them alone. Is All Might okay? Izuku looked at him. Murray sighed. Izuku hated when people lied to him. He supposed that having his father lie to him about almost everything in his life has definitely affected his opinion towards lying. No, and I'm not sure if he will be, but he'll survive. Murray pointed to his eye, telling Izuku that he'd looked into the man's future. He felt a bit better when Izuku smiled. That's good. I really like him. Me too, buddy. Me too, tilde. He's dead. Murray looked up from his notebook at All Might. All for One is gone. All Might killed someone. He killed someone. The thought of it left a sour taste in his mouth, but he ignored it in favor of finishing the report. He was almost done when All Might spoke again. Sasaki. Murray looked up at him. Can't Izuku heal people if he has the components? His heart stopped. Was All Might asking him if Izuku could heal him? That would require Izuku to be in the room during surgery, to see the inside of a person's body. A 9-year-old had zero business seeing that. Yes, Murray started, holding his notebook to his chest. But I don't want him to be seeing organs this young. Or ever, unless he became a doctor, but that's a different story. All Might wasn't looking at him. Murray. The man jolted at the use of his name. I'm dying. I need help, and Izuku's the only one I know and trust enough to help. He doesn't have any medical training other than healing bruises. Murray heard the door open and looked to Recovery Girl for help. Recovery Girl, please explain to him why having Izuku heal him is a bad idea at the moment. Unfortunately, I agree with him. The old woman closed the door behind her. Izuku's quirk would help keep All Might alive longer than if Izuku didn't help. Again, Izuku has no medical training and is 9. And I can tell him what to do during the surgery. All we need is your permission for it, and I'll handle the paperwork. Murray looked between the two. They were ganging up on him. We can ask Izuku. No. He'd want to help no matter what. He loves to help people, then why won't you let him help me? Murray quickly turned to All Might before sitting back down, defeated. Fine. Annoyance was present in his voice. But we do it on my terms. Izuku gets breaks before he reaches his limit, and if he wants out, you let him out. Got it? Recovery Girl nodded. You can trust that I'll keep an eye on him. I'll get the paperwork started. It'll take a few days though. Go home and rest, Sasaki. Murray was silent on the ride home. Izuku curled up in the back seat asleep after his discharge from the hospital. Nightai got him into his bed, tucked him in, left the room, and dug into his pocket for his cigarettes as he walked outside. Izuku stirred and glared at his window for daring to blind him with sunlight this early in the day. A crash sounded off in the living room, and Izuku jolted upright. He creeped to his door and looked outside it towards the crash when his heart stopped. Murray was in pain, a white shoe flat on the man's back keeping him on the ground. Izuku's eyes went up, and he met very familiar golden hues. Izuku. Murray's voice was small and quiet. Izuku almost didn't hear it. Run. Kai simply brought his foot up, then slammed it down. A sickening series of snaps and cracks sounded off from Murray, who went still. Kai started to make his way over to Izuku. Buttercup raced forward, ready to bite. But she ended up as a red stain on the wall as Izuku fell to his knees. Izuku. He closed his eyes as tears started to flow from them. Izuku. His father reached out to him. Izuku. Izuku's eyes snapped open, and he felt hands around his wrists. His eyes adjusted to the darkness of his room, and he looked around while his heartbeat filled his ears. He followed the grip on his wrists and saw Murray looking worried. He smelled like smoke. Izuku. Izuku launched himself at his dad and pressed an ear to the man's chest. He listened to the beat of the man's heart and slowly tried to match his own to it. Murray moved onto the bed more and held him close. Neither wanted to let go. Buttercup was curled up next to Murray as he rubbed Izuku's back as his son was curled up in his lap, listening to his heartbeat. This wasn't the first time he'd woken Izuku from a nightmare, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Not even close to it. He'd gotten plenty of experience at comforting his son afterwards, but he could tell that this one was different. He moved his hand into Izuku's hair, ruffling the curls tickling his chin. Do you want to talk about it? Izuku shook his head and buried his face into his chest, curling up tighter. How about? Izuku looked up. What quirk do you think Buttercup would have if she had one? Izuku paused and thought for a few seconds, his eyes flickering to and fro. I think a shield-type quirk. He reached out and set his hand on Buttercup's head. She leaned into it. What makes you say that? Murray moved his hand to her back. 'Cause she wants to protect me. Shields protect people. Buttercup's tail started to wag. Good point. Think it would be a bubble around her or a wall in front of her? Murray pondered. This exchange continued for a while. Izuku slowly calmed down in his dad's hold. Question. Izuku looked up at him. I might have an answer. Murray responded and looked down at him. Can I have another journal for my quirk analysis? Murray's brows furrowed. I got you one 2 months ago. How is it already full? Izuku got up and went to his desk, turning on the light and bringing his journal to Murray. He sat next to him and started to flip through the pages, showing him all the analyses he had written. Murray smiled as he listened to Izuku talk happily about his hobby. Maybe you should become a hero. Help save people with that big brain of yours. He ruffled Izuku's hair again. The boy smiled lightly and hugged him tightly. If I become a hero, could I work with you? Izuku looked up at him. Murray couldn't say no to that face even if he tried. Murray sat in the hospital waiting room. Jamika was asleep in her room here, and All Might was in surgery with Recovery Girl and Izuku. His mother was on shift at a different hospital. His brother was in class, and Aizawa wasn't responding, so he was probably asleep. He wasn't sure how long it had been. They'd arrived hours ago. Now he just had to wait for the surgery to be done. He looked towards Gran Torino, who was sleeping in his seat. So much for having someone to talk to. Eventually a familiar old lady came out of the doors and waved him and Gran, after Murray woke him up. Over. The surgery was a success. No issues with All Might, but they will be keeping an eye on him for a bit in case one of the donor organs are rejected by his body. She walked as she talked with them. Murray, however, was nervous about why Izuku wasn't next to her. Maybe he was getting cleaned up. They made it to All Might's room. The man was still sleeping and looked a lot better than he did before. Worry kept eating away at Murray as Gran went into the room. "Recovery girl." She looked at him. "Where's Izuku?" Tilda Murray's chest hurt as he looked through the glass. His hands tangled in his shirt over his heart. His eyes were wide. His quirk drawbacks hit in a very different way than normal, and we just didn't expect it after the surgery. He had just finished cleaning his hands when he collapsed and went unresponsive. Recovery girl's voice echoed in his mind as he watched nurses in plastic suits treat Izuku, his son. Izuku was asleep at that moment. An oxygen mask was on his face while he slept. His hands were clean but laid still by his sides. His chest rose and fell. But that was it. No smiling, no laughter, just the silence of a child whose immune system failed after a surgery. He saw the nurses leave the room, and they explained his condition. He was stable, but it could change at any moment. He never should have agreed to this. Not if this was the price Izuku had to pay. Murray sat in the chair across from the window and held his head in his hands. He felt a tap on his shoulder, so he looked up at the perpetrator. Chimiko looked back at him. One of her arms was wrapped in a maroon-colored cast and held up to her chest with an over-the-shoulder holder. Her head was wrapped as well. One leg was wrapped up, and the other had burns peeking out from under her gown. She looked at Izuku through the glass, then sat down next to Murray. He leaned onto her good shoulder, and she wrapped her arm around his back and squeezed his shoulders. It reminded him of his mother, so he leaned into the hug and accepted the comfort of a friend. It was a comfort he couldn't give to his own son without risking killing him. Tears started to fall despite his best efforts. Chimiko just hugged him and stayed silent. He needed someone, just like she had. And he had been there for her, so it made sense to repay the favor. Murray couldn't help the small smile that graced his face as he gazed through the window at Izuku, who was awake and responsive in his room. His boy waved to him from his spot on his bed. Murray waved back, but paused when he saw All Might round the corner. His boss also paused when he noticed him. "Oh, Sasaki, thought you'd be home with Izuku?" He didn't know, he realized. "Or are you visiting that girl you've made friends with?" Murray shook his head. "Izuku can't come home for at least 2 months. He turned his attention to Izuku, who was chatting with the nurse in his room. All Might approached and looked through the window. His smile disappeared. He turned to Murray and was about to open his mouth to ask a question when the green-haired adult spoke up first. Something happened in the surgery that caused him to have a massive quirk backlash that ended up with his immune system getting destroyed. Toshinori felt bad. This was his fault, and it was clear that Murray somewhat agreed, even if the man wasn't going to say it to his face. "What are you doing out of bed? Don't you need to stay under watch for a bit?" His sidekick looked up at him. "Villains are still out there." Murray's brows furrowed. "Someone will replace All for One." The frown deepened on his face. "So you're going back out there? You just got healed." Murray turned to face him. "And while I'm happy that Izuku helped bring me back to my full health, it's my job to be the symbol of peace." All Might held a hand to his chest. His sidekick rolled his eyes, along with his head. "Oh, so Izuku should risk his life again to heal you next time this type of thing happens." Murray crossed his arms in front of his chest. "Are you not happy that I'm alive?" All Might's voice raised into a shout. "I'm pissed off that you think your life is more important than a 9-year-old's. Murray was yelling back at him. "Wait." All Might started. "Go back. What do you mean next time?" Murray stopped in his tracks. "You looked into my future, didn't you?" Murray stumbled before sighing. "Yes, but I thought I told you to never look into my future." A bitter taste came into All Might's mouth at the knowledge of Murray breaking that promise. "You were on your deathbed. I had to know if you were going to be okay." Murray's worry seeped into his voice. Toshinori walked past his sidekick. The man paused before turning towards him. "All Might," his voice was raised. "If you continue like this, you'll face off against a villain and die an unspeakably gruesome death." The man kept walking. Murray's face fell. "If you keep walking, I quit." All Might paused for a moment, but continued down the hallway. Murray sat down in the seat he had used before and buried his hands into his hair. He looked down the hall at All Might's retreating form with a small amount of regret buried under the anger and sorrow. All Might's walk faltered as soon as he stepped foot outside the hospital. He just ruined his only close friendship in years over one argument. He continued walking with a heavy heart weighing him down. It was too late to fix it now. Izuku smiled as a finger poked his forehead, letting out a tiny squeak. He looked up at Murai happily. He was finally allowed to be moved to a normal room. His immune system had returned with a vengeance a month into his recovery, and now they were in the final days of just monitoring him. Izuku stopped for a bit before looking up at Murai. I want to be a hero. I want to help people. When you're all done healing, we can tell Shouta, and he'll probably help get you ready for whatever hero school you pick. Izuku smiled wide. It was infectious. Murai was at the front desk checking in to spend time with his son for his birthday, when an alarm went off in the hospital. Metal shutters slammed down, locking everyone inside. No one could get in or out. What's going on? The receptionist looked at him. Room 149 pressed their panic button. That's only supposed to be used for when a villain is in their room. That was Izuku's room number. Murai ran with the doctors and few able heroes up the steps. They could hear someone yelling in the stairwell. It also sounded like someone was hitting someone else with something metal. They made it to the floor, and everyone halted as a man rushed out of a room and ran towards them just in time to dodge an Roman 4 pole thrown out the door at him. Murray watched the man get tackled by 6 different nurses while he ran down the hall to his son's room. He looked up at the open door to see Izuku walk out the room. He was walking with his Roman 4 drip on a rolling Roman 4 pole. He looked angry, but paused at the sight of Murray. The two quickly went to the other, meeting halfway in a hug. Murray looked Izuku over for new injuries, finding only marks from what seemed like rope. That's when he remembered the Roman 4 pole. I defended myself because I'm not allowed to leave, Izuku said proudly. He was smiling. Izuku, you threw that. Murray looked at Izuku, staying in his knelt-down position to be at eye level with him. Izuku nodded and hit him with it. Izuku moved his arms like he was holding a bat. Murray chuckled and held Izuku's hands, looking at the small rope burns on him. Smart? Do they hurt at all? Izuku shrugged. Murray's concern grew. I don't know. Izuku met his eyes, which gave Murray an idea on why he didn't know. He took his middle and index fingers and gently pressed them to Izuku's neck, checking the boy's heartbeat. That feels weird. A giggle and a smile rose out of Izuku at the touch. You're hyped up on adrenaline. Murray scooped him up carefully and moved Izuku to his room. Nurses followed him and checked Izuku over more than Murray did. Eventually, when things calmed down, Murray had his arms crossed over Izuku's bed. The boy had fallen fast asleep as the exhaustion from fighting back and crash from the adrenaline hit him like a truck. Murray felt a yawn of his own escape and set his head down on his arms. A nap didn't sound too bad right now. He closed his eyes. It took a few more days, but eventually, Murray was allowed to take Izuku home. He pulled into his driveway and Izuku could swear he had seen the truck parked across the street before. He didn't pay it any more attention, because Murray opened the gate to the house. Izuku followed him in, jolting when Murray loudly closed the gate. Within seconds, Izuku was tackled by a mass of golden fur and his face was assaulted with licks by Buttercup. Her tail went a mile a minute as Izuku laughed with his mouth closed. It took him a while, but eventually he managed to get up and rushed to the door with Buttercup close behind him. Murray opened the door and Izuku went in, quickly taking off his shoes, then rushing to the living room. Murray saw him freeze just as the call went out. Welcome home. Izuku looked around the room. The Idas, Monomas, Kirishimas, Yaoyarazas, and the other Sasakis were in the living room. It was decorated with streamers and such. A smile cracked onto his face, and he started to run around the room hugging everyone one at a time. Murray chuckled softly when Izuku came to him last and hugged his legs. He smiled as well, picking up the 10-year-old. Oh, you're getting heavy. A whine came out of Izuku. Just kidding. He put Izuku down and both walked towards the party guests. The kids quickly took over the TV, playing video games, watching shows, and watching movies. The adults kept to themselves, chatting in the kitchen about their jobs, their kids, and generally anything that came to mind. Murray felt a bit better after talking to the other adults, realizing his new support network of friends. His gaze flickered to Izuku, who was fighting with Ijiru. Murray had all these new friends because he took Izuku in. He smiled lightly. He didn't regret it. He'd do it again in a heartbeat. Tensei tapped on his shoulder, and offered him a slip of paper. A number was on it. "Here, this is the number I called to start my own agency. It should help you with yours." The Ida smiled at him. Tilda Murray woke up the next morning in the blanket fort that the kids had made. He felt something pressing against his back, so he looked behind him. Chimiko was sleeping with her front pressed against his back, her arms tucked against her chest. He looked around the room. Izuku was sleeping with Buttercup curled up next to him. Izuku's hand curled around Murai's index and middle finger. Ijiru was curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow to death. Tenya was on the other side of the couch, covered in a blanket, and Bobcat was sleeping on the boy's calves. Momo was in a sleeping bag her parents got her, and was curled enough that Murai could only see the top half of her face. Nito was asleep, using Momo's legs as a pillow and holding onto them. Murai sat up and sketched out his limbs, freeing his fingers from Izuku's hold. He started on breakfast for the kids. Buttercup sat on the edge of the kitchen and watched him, so he tossed a small extra bit of food to her. She caught it and chowed down. Bobcat, however, woke up to the scent of food and quickly stole some food right off the countertop. He made a daring escape under the couch after using Izuku's stomach as a landing pad and waking the poor boy up. Murai made a face as he heard Izuku slowly get up. The boy simply went to the bathroom and Murai heard the shower start up, so he left Izuku alone. Chimiko and the kids were still dead asleep. Chimiko had moved to be laying on her back during Bobcat's stealing mission. Nito had stirred a little, just enough to move to a more comfortable position, but he was back to sleep as soon as he got comfy. Murray moved the finished breakfast to the coffee table and started to try and wake everyone up. Chimiko glared at him for a few seconds, but got up and scooted to the table. Nito whined, and it took Murai ripping away his blanket to get him up. Momo woke up around the same time as Tenya and rubbed her eyes as she moved to the table. Tenya shook Ijiru awake, and the two dropped down to the coffee table. Izuku came in with a towel around his shoulders and new clothes, his hair soaked and resting on the towel. "You know, if you wrap the towel around your head, it'll dry your hair faster." Chimiko pointed her chopsticks towards Izuku's head. "I have to brush it when it's wet or I'll break the brush," Izuku stated as he sat down at the coffee table. Murai passed him the utensils needed for the food. "That's smart, but it's better to do it in the shower," she replied, starting to dig into her food. "This is really good, Sasaki." "Thank you." Murray nodded his head lightly towards her. "What's the difference?" "The constant stream of water keeps your hair nice and wet while you're brushing it. Plus, you can also use the brush for shower karaoke," Chimiko explained, smiling at the last part of it. The kids let out laughter at that. All Might looked at his phone, thumb hovering over the call button. With a sigh, he turned off his phone. Murai probably didn't want to talk to him. Not after what he did. After what he did to Izuku. Toshi wondered how the boy was, and if he was okay. With a sigh, he stood up and left his agency. He had work to do. The Monoma stayed until they finished the breakfast Murai had made, saying their goodbyes as Chimiko left to drop Nito off at home with a sitter and head to work. Ijiru and Tenya were picked up soon after by their respective guardians. Momo was picked up by her mother around noon. Their day was very uneventful. Izuku was kept busy with catching up on his missing schoolwork from the last 2 months, while Murai was at his computer slowly going through the steps of finding a building for his own agency. Eventually he found the perfect one. It was spacious, had a gym inside, and plenty of offices to use. So he called up the number he was given to by Tensei at the party. The call went all right. The person on the other line sounded a bit dead inside, but Murai wasn't going to judge. He answered the necessary questions and gave the required information about the building. The call ended and Murai looked at the boxes of stuff he took out of his office back at All Might's agency. A yawn escaped him, and he stretched. Dinner time had long since passed and Izuku was curled up on the couch sleeping, having had a nightmare and not wanting to be alone. It wasn't a bad one, as Izuku managed to wake himself up from it. But it was still a nightmare. Mori scooped Izuku up and moved him to his bedroom, tucking him in and turning off the light. Mori sat next to Izuku on the mountain top, watching the gentle snowfall from under the cover of a tree. Izuku was fixing his board. One of his boots had come loose, and he really didn't want to add a broken leg to his list of injuries from snowboarding. "Hey Dad?" Murray let out a hum. "Are you okay?" That made Murray pause. He had expected something completely different, but he knew Izuku wouldn't drop it until he got an answer. "I'm not sure, but I know I will be." Izuku accepted the answer and finished fixing his boots and stood up, Murray following suit. They both headed down the mountainside, racing each other down. Tilda tilde. Izuku ran about the backyard with his friends playing tag, and he was it. Kyojin watched them play from the back door, her hands busy petting Buttercup behind her ears. Murai and Tensei were in the house getting lunch ready. Tenya's quirk sparked to life, and he bolted out of Izuku's range, crashing right into the fence. The game ended as the kids rushed over to check on him. Kyojin went inside to grab the first aid kit. It hurts. Tenya held his hands over his nose, tears starting to well up in his eyes. Here, let me see it. Izuku reached for his friend's nose and numbed it by spreading the nerves just far enough apart to not register pain. He then slowly let his quirk work its magic and heal the injury, which wasn't anything more than a bloody nose and what would be a bruise. He then reconnected the nerves and let go. It doesn't hurt as much anymore. Tenya felt his nose, sniffling still. Thank you. Izuku smiled at him. They looked over at Kyojin when she came over with the first aid kit, but paused when she saw that he wasn't hurt. She tilted her head curiously. Izuku healed it already. Nito answered her unasked question. With a chuckle, she ruffled Tenya's and Izuku's hair and went back to her spot next to the door. My quirk isn't that flashy. Ijiru held his arms sadly. While that may be true, it could be super useful. Ijiru activated his quirk on his arm, hardening it to a sharp point. Izuku's eyes widened happily. You could be a shield hero. Ijiru jolted at Izuku's raised voice. You could probably stop a bullet, or a knife, or a sword. And with Izuku's healing, my speed, Momo's creation, and Monoma's copying, we'd be an unstoppable team. Tenya spoke up, getting to his feet and into a heroic pose, the others following suit. Then it's settled. Ijiru's smile was back. We'll be a hero team. The kids started a game of heroes versus villains, Kyojin becoming a hostage for the villain side and needing to be saved by the heroes. Momo was a hero who got defeated by the villain Nito. Izuku was also a villain and was fighting Tenya, and Ijiru was now fighting Nito. Kyojin cheered on her little rescue team as they bravely fought to save her. Tensei placed the plates onto the table in the needed spots when he paused. He grabbed a picture frame of a woman with straight green hair and round green eyes. He tilted his head lightly. Hey Murray, he heard a hum from the kitchen. Who's this? He turned the picture frame around to show it to Murray. Oh, that's Izuku's mother. Chimiko managed to find a high school photo from her high school days, and Izuku uses it as a headstone for her in a sense, so please put it back on the shelf. Tensei nodded and put it right back where it had been and moved into the kitchen. He pet Bobcat, who was on Murray's shoulders, before pausing. Wait, did you just call Monoma by her given name? The knife Murray had been using slammed down with too much force as he jolted. Oh, she's a close friend. She actually trains Izuku in his quirk analysis. We've known each other for a while, so it'd make sense to use given names, much like me and you. Tensei got closer to him. Please don't. Do you like her? He looked smug, like he uncovered a secret. Is she peanut butter to your jelly? She's actually allergic to peanuts. Murray turned back to the chicken he was cutting, bringing a small bit up to feed to the cat on his shoulder. Answer the question. A finger poked into his side. No, she's just a friend. Murray didn't realize his face was starting to show his annoyance. Can't two people of the opposite gender be friends? Yeah, look at Kyojin. Tensei pointed at the back door. But I'm asking cause you jolted. He quickly backed up when a knife was pointed at his face. I am going to stab you in the thigh if you don't drop this talk right this second. Murray stabbed the knife into the cutting board and put the cut-up chicken into a frying pan. Geez, no need to get violent. Tensei went back to setting the table. Stay out of my love life then. Also, bold of you to assume I'm straight. Tensei choked on his own spit, whipping around to look at Murray. Wait, what? Murray chuckled lightly. I'm bi, but don't spread that around. Last thing I need is more creepy fan mail. Tensei snorted. You get those too? The two settled into a chat about the creepiest things fans they had been sent, ranging from love confessions to one person having sent a vial of what they could only hope was the fan's blood. Eventually, they called the kids in and Murray dished out the servings for each kiddo. What's this? Tenya asked, lightly lifting the noodles with his fork. Chicken Alfredo. Izuku and Nito both answered at the same time. They looked at each other before breaking into a fit of giggles. Aunt Kai makes American dishes on occasion, And this is one she taught Sasaki cause Izuku likes it. Nito explained after he calmed down enough to get words out. She even gave him an American cookbook for his birthday this year, Izuku added on, pointing at the cupboard that housed all the cookbooks. Tensei raised a brow at Mirai, but quickly lowered it when the man glared at him. So he quickly stuffed his face with the food in front of him, getting Tenya to lightly yell that he was eating sloppily. Izuku and Nito started talking about quirks as they ate. Ijiru chatted with Momo about how to care for long hair. That's when Tenya remembered something. Oh, everyone looked at him. Me, Izuku, Momo, Ijiru, and Monoma want to be a hero team. Murray looked up to watch Izuku's facial expressions. He looked happy and excited. Kyojin spoke first, a bit of worry in her voice. What do you mean? With Ig as a protector, Izu as a healer, Momo, me, and Monoma as fighters. Tenya smiled happily. Izuku isn't just a healer. He can also pack quite a punch. Murray would know. He recently joined in on Izuku's training, and was even doubled over once when Izuku missed the punching bag and got him in the gut. Hero teams take a lot of trust and hard work. Are you willing to do that? Tensei spoke up next, smiling as he looked at his little brother. All 5 kids nodded. The adults smiled, and they finished their lunch before Murray brought out the ice cream and cake. The candles shined brightly in the darkness, dimly lighting the room. Looking at his cake with a smile, he blew out the candles, making a wish. Murray unlocked the glass doors to the building and pushed open the door with his shoulder. The hinges squealed as it opened, and he made a mental note to grease them a bit later. Izuku walked into the empty building behind him. Murray closed the door and locked it, not wanting to be bugged by anyone while checking out his new building. Izuku was walking around the lobby, a red scarf wrapped around his neck that was hiding half of his face. He lowered it and looked around the empty building, before pausing, making a face, and then sneezing loudly. The sneeze echoed through the room as Izuku rubbed at his nose. Dusty. Murray chuckled. They'd probably have to clean the place a bit, as it looks like it hasn't been used in years. They walked into a different room, the gym. It was spacious, and had old padding on the floor. Izuku pressed his foot onto it, and then screamed when a cockroach ran out from under it. Fucking bullshit. Murray whipped his head around at Izuku after the words left his mouth. That was Korean. How did Izuku know Korean? Izuku. The boy looked at him with a slight distressed look. When did you learn Korean? Father and Hari taught me. Something about needing it when I'm older. Only know basic phrases and what I've heard from the other Yakuza. Izuku put his hands in his jacket pockets, burrowing his face into his scarf. Plus, I've been trying to relearn it in my free time. And you never told me? Murray wondered what else Izuku never told him about. You never asked, and I never really had any point in saying anything in Korean since no one around me spoke it. With that, Izuku started to walk around the gym. Fair point. Murray admitted. It hadn't crossed his mind that Izuku might know a different language, especially since he didn't know English, but could recognize the language. They moved into the offices upstairs and looked around. Murray found one that could be a good meeting room and another for his office. Izuku found one that could be his space whenever he was in the office, either as a sidekick or a visitor. Murray tapped Nito on the shoulder lightly and motioned for the boy to follow him off to the side, while Chimiko was showing Izuku how to groom a horse. Izuku was a little bit scared of the large Shire, but was pushing through. Though he was pressing himself into the 5'7" woman like she was some type of shield. Luckily she found it adorable and let him use her as a shield. Nito, I have a question for you, and I want your honest opinion. Murray knelt down to be eye level with a blonde 12-year-old, who was starting to have a questioning look on his face. Okay, would you be okay with me dating your aunt? Nito's eyes widened. He looked surprised. Why are you asking me that? A suspicious look fell onto the boy's face. I want to make sure that you're okay with it before I ask her. The blonde looked around before asking, puffing his chest out to look threatening. All it did was make him look like an angry kitten. Okay, you can date her, but hurt her at all and I'll fight you. He pointed at Murray's face, and the man nodded before making an X over his chest with one hand and the other in the air. I promise I won't hurt her. Nito smiled and ran back to his aunt. Murray stood up and watched as Nito started to help Izuku. Hey Chimiko. Murray had his hands cupped around his mouth. Once she looked over at him, he waved her over. Yeah, she smiled at him once she got over. He looked down at her. Want to go on a date? Chimiko paused, a puzzled look quickly sweeping over her face. Who are you, and what did you do with Murray? Tilda. The preteen rolled into his back. You can't tell me what to do. You're not my real. The kid burst out laughing mid-sentence. I couldn't finish it. What were you trying to say? Sir Nightai looked at the boy with a brow raised. The stupid you can't tell me what to do. You're not my real dad. Mine. Sir Nightai smirked and offered a hand to the kid. Nightai stood in front of Moshi. Short version. Izuku's my adoptive son. His biological father is a villain that I'm now investigating. Moshi nodded. It explained a little bit of what just happened, but he'd prefer more details. And the long version? Will be in a file on your desk on your first day here. Welcome to the Nightai Agency. Nightai held a hand out to him. Moshi shook it. Thank you for taking me on. I'll make sure you won't regret it. Izuku dashed towards his teacher with a bakken shaped like a katana, the wooden sword grazing his teacher's hip, while Shouta's own bakken slammed into Izuku's ankle and threw his balance off. Suddenly Izuku smelt plastic matting as his face was forced into the gym mats. His bakken was held against his back, but his hands couldn't move due to the pressure of his teacher's grip. Izuku let out a small groan of pain. Hari let out a chuckle as Izuku curled up in his sweater, the little cat onesie tail sticking out from the bundle of gray fabric. He stayed in place reading a book as the 2-year-old fell asleep in the warmth of Hari's sweater. It was a few hours of silence before Inko joined him. She handed him a small black box. Placing the book down, he lifted the box up and lightly shook it, not wanting to wake up Izuku. He pointed to himself. Inko nodded. He opened it up and pulled out the object. It was a black leather rose key decoration. Eyes widening, he looked at Inko. It's a thank you gift. For everything you've done for me. She scooped Izuku up when he started to get fussy in his sleep, scooting to the wall next to Hari. It smells like a rose too. There's a perfume bottle in there too that matches the scent, so it shouldn't ever stop smelling nice. Inko smiled happily at Hari, Izuku's head resting on her chest. Thank you, Inko. He brought it up to his nose and sniffed. Sure enough, it smelled like a rose. He smiled and hooked it onto his keychain. Inko frowned before grabbing his arm. Hari, he looked at her and quickly became concerned by the serious look on her face. I need you to swear on your honor for me. A jolt ran down Hari's spine. His honor. That wasn't something to swear on willy-nilly. It meant he had to honor the promise no matter what, even if it could kill him. I want to know what I'm swearing to before I do so. Inko stood up. Hari followed. Kurono Hari. Inko started using her Yakuza voice. Do you swear upon your honor that no matter what it takes, even if it meant betraying the family, killing someone, or dying, that you'll protect Izuku at all costs? That you'll make sure he keeps a smile and stays happy no matter what, even if I were to die before it was my time? Hari looked at Inko. He pondered before dropping down to one knee and bowing his head. One hand in the air out flat, the other over his heart. I, Kurono Hari, swear on my honor that I will protect Izuku at all costs, even if I have to betray the family, kill someone, or die. That I'll protect his smile and happiness to my dying breath. If I do not uphold this promise. He looked up at Inko. Then I will take my own life to restore my honor and pay for breaking my promise. Inko smiled and knelt down, and felt Hari cup her cheek. She leaned into it. And if I have to go through Kai to make Izuku happy? He pressed his forehead to hers. I will do so. Inko smiled, and she looked down at the toddler sleeping on her chest. Let's hope you never have to die for Izuku. He'd be heartbroken. Hari smiled at her. Hari's eyes snapped open to his phone going off. He rubbed his eyes and picked it up. Hello? He sat up and went to his dresser. Hari, Kai's voice. I have a lead on Izuku. Get to my office as soon as you can. The call ended and Hari rubbed a hand over his face. He looked at the picture on his dresser. It was of Izuku on his shoulders. Inko was in the background and a Sakura branch was in the 4-year-old's grip. It was taken months before the incident. Hari covered his mouth as bile rose in his throat, as he remembered that fateful night, the night Izuku left. He changed into his working clothes, grabbed his keys, brought the black leather rose to his nose, and walked to Kai's office. Overhaul ran his fingers through his hair with a sigh. He had been tracking Sir Nightai through All Might, and suddenly the two weren't working together anymore. And Nightai wasn't a popular hero like All Might was, so it was extremely easy to track since he was the #1 hero. And now it's near impossible to find anything on Sir Nightai without getting millions of websites talking about the betrayal of Sir Nightai, or blogs that only had teenagers lusting after the man and no useful information. Any address online was to a PO box for fan mail, and there were cameras everywhere. So that was useless, unless he wanted to send Izuku anything. But he couldn't do so without possibly revealing his location to the hero, so that was out of the question. Hari entered the office and Kai stood up. Sakaki has heard bar rumors of a group of kids playing in the woods. They match Izuku's friends. Hari hated that Kai believed that Izuku's new friends were just distractions. Description. So we're going to go check it out to make sure it's them and possibly Izuku. Hari nodded and turned to follow Kai. Izuku. I feel like that is very unsafe. Tenya's voice echoed in the abandoned warehouse. Izuku didn't listen. Instead he kept climbing until he was in the rafters, several feet above the ground. Aijuru and Momo quickly followed, wanting to see the view as well. Nito was next and Tenya finally went up after them. Izuku chuckled as he sat down with his legs hanging off. It was like a cliff in a sense. With a loud bang, the door slammed open and several men filed in. Tenya and Izuku froze when they recognized one. The man who made Tenya pass out simply by holding him. Izuku made a zipper movement over his mouth, and then pointed at a window at the far side of the warehouse. The five split up, and started to scoot their way across the rafters towards freedom. Izuku stopped, a bucket of dirty, rusty water in front of him. An idea sparked into his mind, and, with a lot of difficulty, he relayed his plan to his friends. After a long pause, Aijuru took the bucket and scooted to a specific area. Momo and Tenya did as well. Tenya caught the metal bucket from Momo's back, and the confetti coming out of the back of her neck as they scooted along. Nito and Izuku overhauled the rafters to make it easier and less deadly for them to bolt across them to the exit. Izuku made it to the exit. He almost felt like this was a sort of game. A game that if he lost he would be kidnapped. But he's kept away this long, he doubted he'd get caught now. He gave a thumbs up to Aijuru, who dropped the bucket of water, and the bucket, onto Nemoto. The blonde collapsed onto the concrete. Tenya and Momo both dumped their bucket of confetti onto Tengai, who grimaced at his state. The second he looked up at the rafters, a metal bucket fell onto his face. The kids quickly bolted through the rafters and out their exit with their distraction. Izuku caught Momo, and then Kiri. Then Nito was caught by Momo. Tenya was caught by the others. All five bolted and Izuku paused to look back at the warehouse, only to meet eyes with his godfather, whose own eyes widened before he quickly moved, as if he never saw him, and was running around the warehouse looking for them. Izuku took the hint and ran after his friends to Tenya's house, since it was the closest. Izuku sat in the gym on his phone quietly. He was on a pull-up bar, his feet wrapped around on the pole, holding his makeshift seat up, helping keep his balance on the bar. Aizawa had been called to Yua about an interview he was dragged into doing by his friends. He heard someone clear their throat behind him and paused his game to look behind at the person. His eyes widened when he realized their identity. The man panicked and shushed him. Izuku covered his mouth, only to remove his hands after a few seconds. "What are you doing here? I heard you were going to become a hero, that right?" All Might looked up at the teen. Izuku looked so different. He looked more mature. The boy nodded. "I wanted to ask you a few questions." Izuku gestured for him to move back, and once the hero did, Izuku moved to the center of the bar and grabbed it. He moved his weight backwards, sending the rest of him the same direction, once upside down. He unhooked his legs and planted his feet on the mat under him. He turned and looked up at All Might. "Sure, what do you need?" All Might shook his head to get out of his stupor. "What's your drive to be a hero?" The question made Izuku pause. He lightly tilted his head and held his chin with his hand. Part of the reason he wanted to become a hero was to say fuck you to his father. The other half being a want to help people. To help people, and to show that even with a villain for a parent, you can still become a hero. Izuku looked up at him. All Might smiled. "I want to tell you about a quirk, mine to be exact." So, you want me to be your successor? To give me a quirk that's been passed down for generations, and possibly was my great-great-great-great-grandfather's quirk, but also was the quirk of my grandmother on my mother's side of the family. Izuku's hands were pressed together and pointing at All Might. "Well, it sounds complicated when you put it like that." All Might shrugged with a smile. "It's ultimately up to you, Sasaki." It was a lot to take in, Izuku thought, staring pensively at the ground. But it would make him a better hero. So there really wasn't a reason to say no, was there? Having made his decision, Izuku turned his focus back to All Might. "I'll do it. I'll be your successor." All Might smiled widely. "But I'm following my own training plan, so Aizawa-sensei doesn't know." "Good idea. Remind me again why you want to build muscle." Aizawa sat on the gym mat with a water bottle in hand. "You're not exactly built for heavy muscles." Izuku looked up at him from his spot on the floor, where he was doing push-ups. "So I don't break my arms as easily, and the muscle I can build up will help with stuff I need it for. Like punching or lifting something heavy." "That's fair." Aizawa stood up when his phone buzzed. "Do 20 more. I need to go deal with something, stay in here." Izuku nodded and went back to focusing on his exercise. He finished and took a seat to drink some water. The door opened, causing Izuku's eyes to look over at it. All Might waved lightly as he walked over. "You definitely have gotten better at this. Then again, the last I saw you was when you were 9. All Might's smile faltered for a split second as he had the memory of seeing Izuku stuck in a quarantine room, and an emotionally distanced Murray wasn't far behind. "I think I'd be able to transfer the quirk before the UA entrance exams start up," Izuku laughed. All Might had his own phone light up and excused himself to go do his job. Izuku waved his goodbye before taking a sip of water. Aizawa entered the room soon after. Training finished early that day when Aizawa got called away to deal with a second villain. So Izuku was dropped off at home, and he went to the bathroom to freshen up a little. He turned on the sink and rubbed clean water onto his face. Once done, he grabbed the nearby towel and dried it. He put it back onto its rack and took one last look in the mirror. Izuku paused when he looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears. In the mirror, he didn't see himself, but his father. Next thing Izuku knew, the mirror was shattered and his hand was bleeding. His eyes and heart stung just as badly as the cuts on his knuckles. He sunk to the glass-riddled floor and pressed his head to the cabinet under the sink. A few seconds later, the door opened and Murai's words fell on deaf ears as Izuku realized. He looked like his father. Murai frowned as Izuku looked lost in his own head. His eyes cast downwards as he wrapped the boy's hand up in bandages after cleaning it and making sure there wasn't any glass left in it. Why did he punch the mirror? Did training go badly today? Was he upset at something? What was he thinking? "I look like him." Murai paused. I hate it. Izuku's hands grabbed fistfuls of his hair, and he kept repeating himself. tears streaming down his face again. Why couldn't I have looked like my mom? Why did I have to turn out looking like him? I hate it. Isn't having his quirk and eye color and shape enough torture? Murai wrapped his arms around Izuku, who silently cried in his shoulder. He couldn't think of a response, so he held on to his son. I want my mom back. Murai came home to Izuku sleeping on the couch using Chimiko as a pillow. There were still tear trails running down his face, meaning he knocked out recently. Chimiko just kept up her movement, having lulled him to sleep by rubbing circles on his back. Murai ran a hand through his boy's hair while frowning. Everything was going so well. Why did he have a breakdown about his mother and his looks now? He looked to Chimiko for an answer, despite knowing she probably wouldn't have won either. She met his gaze. Was it because he was now engaged to Chimiko? Did Izuku start seeing her as a mother figure, and thus think she's trying to replace Inko? Was he really that upset about his looks? Does Izuku have body dysmorphia? How could they help? Murai placed the new bandages and first aid kit down on the counter before grabbing a blanket and covering the two on the couch. Thank you, Murai. We have to talk in the morning though. But not now. Chimiko went back to focusing on Izuku. Though, could you bring me the painkillers? I want them in reach in case I get a headache like normal. Murai nodded and got them out of the cupboard and placed them near her before going to check on Nito in the boys' bedroom. Izuku swallowed the barf that tried to come back up, quickly downing it with water to soothe his throat and get rid of the taste. I hate it. The teen stuck his tongue out. All Might just lightly hit Izuku's back with a hand. At least it's transferred now. What's transferred? Both froze in place before slowly looking behind them at the voice. An annoyed-looking Aizawa greeted them. One for all. All Might sputtered as Izuku turned around and said that. What's one for all? A quirk that's been passed down for generations and most likely used to belong to my many greats grandpa. Izuku's bandaged hand disappeared into his pockets. Aizawa sighed and just rubbed his face. At least you're being honest now. Aizawa, however, started to glare at All Might. All Might shrunk a little. Technically wasn't lying, just keeping a secret. Izuku muttered just loud enough for Aizawa to catch. 50 laps, barefoot, now. Izuku let out a groan as he went to do the punishment. Aizawa immediately turned to All Might, quirk active. If you dare try to do what you did when you were on your deathbed ever again, Monoma would slaughter you, revive you, and then I would kill you. Got it. All Might nodded quickly. And don't you even think of taking over my lessons. Yua might be thinking of hiring you as a teacher for God knows why. But those classes will be the only time you teach Izuku, if he goes. Aizawa pointed at the door. Now get out. We have training to get done. All Might quickly took his leave before he pissed the man off more. Though something nagged at the back of his mind. Why would Monoma, Murai's drinking buddy, get mad at him? Did she know about One for All? Aizawa watched Izuku picking apart his own broken arm and just decided to get some water for him. So the quirk All Might gave him causes his bones to break when used. Lovely. Murai and Chimiko are going to rip All Might to shreds. Aizawa focused back onto training when Izuku asked for one of his medical journals, which he fetched to help Izuku figure out how to put his arm back together. Which also means that overhaul is a great counter to the bone-breaking part of One for All. Aizawa still wanted to see the Sasaki's rip into All Might though. Aizawa looked up from his desk when a familiar head of yellow walked into the teacher's lounge. He made sure no one else was behind her before speaking. Hello, Monoma, or has it become Sasaki yet? Chimiko smiled at him as she walked past him, carrying some papers. Nope, still Monoma. We're deciding on what to do still. Don't know yet. Chimiko sat down at her own desk to start working on grading paperwork. We don't want a grand old show of it like some people. A nice quiet one sounds nice, but if worst comes to worst, we'll just elope. Aizawa gave a curt nod in response. Chimiko has been a teacher at UA slightly longer than he had been. Then again, Nedzu paid for her tuition in exchange for her working as a teacher to pay off the debt. He had made it with her after the death of her brother and sister-in-law, as most of her money had to go to sudden bills and her grieving nephew. Speaking of whom. How's the boys? Have they picked hero schools yet? Nito wants to come here and Izuku's still deciding. But so far it seems like he's shooting for UA. That made Aizawa raise a brow. Izuku wants to come to UA? He looked over the divider at the woman. The most media-blasted school. It surprised Murray, so I don't blame you. A chuckle rose from Chimiko. He says he mostly wants to go because it means that I'd be here, so he wouldn't have to wait to get picked up by me or Mirai. Aizawa gave it a thought. It definitely would be a good idea. Plus Nezu would most likely love the challenge. He was immediately pulled from his thoughts when the sound of someone vomiting came from beyond the door. I'll give you 1,000 yen to deal with that. Chimiko looked grossed out. 2,000 yen. 1,500 yen. Deal. Aizawa stood up to deal with whatever student decided to barf right by the teacher's lounge. All Might picked up the phone. Before you get mad at me, let me explain myself. All Might started immediately, only to be interrupted by Mirai. I'm not mad at you transferring One for All to Izuku. His voice was calm, and he sounded rational. Oh, All Might's brows furrowed. You're not? I'm pissed off that it breaks his bones whenever he uses it. Mirai started to yell. One for All was doing what? How am I supposed to know that would happen? That never happened to him. He took to the quirk like it was second nature. Besides, if it was his great-grandfather's quirk, wouldn't it make sense that it came to him like second nature? And how am I supposed to explain this to my fiancé and nephew? Oh, by the way, Izuku had a third quirk all along. Do you not realize that your actions have affected people's lives? The phone line went dead, and All Might grimaced. He really should have thought more about this. Wait. Mirai got engaged. Izuku looked at the people in the seats from his spot by Mirai. He was holding a pillow with rings on them, wearing a tux with a bow tie. Nito was on the other side of the altar in his own tux and tie, only he had a tail coming off his suit. Both teenagers were ready to become legally family. They were as thick as thieves, as Chimiko put it. Mirai adjusted his own tie out of nervousness, causing Tensei to chuckle from his spot beside him. Nervous? Mirai looked at him. Shut up. He was, but he didn't want to think about it. Also, does this mean you finally realized that I knew about your feelings for Monoma long before you did? Tensei smiled cheekily, remembering that day. I am not against slapping you right now, Tensei. Mirai glared at the Ida, who he was starting to regret making his best man. I'll be sure to remind you of this every chance I get. Izuku snickered. Mirai responded by lightly hitting the 14-year-old's arm with just his fingers. Izuku froze up instantly. Mirai had hit him, yet it didn't hurt, mentally or physically. Why didn't it hurt? The last time someone hit him, outside of training, it had been his father. Mirai never hit him. Izuku stared at his arm in severe confusion, only stopping once Chimiko started making her way down the aisle. Aizawa standing in for the handoff, seeing as she had no other living family other than her nephew, who already was her man of honor. Once Aizawa handed her off, he sat down, leaving the groom and bride to say their vows. Izuku felt weird. His mind still fogged from the light hit on his shoulder when a hand fell onto his head. It was Mirai. You okay, bud? He sounded worried in his own way. Izuku smiled. Not all hits were bad. He hugged his dad and smiled wide. Chimiko let out an awa at the hug, silently asking for one as well. Izuku hugged her as well. She'd never replace Inko, but she wasn't trying to. She was Chimiko, his new stepmother, and Nito was now his brother-cousin. He loved his new family, and still loved parts of his old one. But it's time he started to live in the present day, and not the past. He was a Sasaki, and no one could change that. All Might waved sheepishly at the teachers gathered to meet him. Everyone here was a hero. Everyone here was a new co-worker. Everyone but one seemed polite, Sasaki Chimiko, who glared at him the entire time. Once lunch started, he learned why everyone said she was one of the scariest teachers. One for All keeps breaking my stepson. All Might's jaw dropped. Her voice was full of venom. From the second he enters Yua, every bone he breaks with that quirk, I will break one of yours. How do you know about One for All? 1. Mirai talks in his sleep, and I'm not a moron. 2. She grabbed his suit collar and began to float. You gave it to my goddamned stepson, who I've trained in quirk analysis for the past 5 years. I know every nook and cranny of his quirk. The lights began to flicker. And if you ever pull the stunt you pulled 6 years ago, I will show you why Mirai thought I was related to All for One. Everything suddenly was back to normal, and the blonde smiled and clapped her hands together once. Welcome to Yua. Have a great year. With that, she walked away. Okay, now I see what Mirai likes about her. All Might watched her disappear down the hallway, heart pounding in his chest. Izuku stretched his limbs out as he woke up. He yawned and got out of bed. Nito was still fast asleep in the bed across from his. Izuku liked sharing a room with Nito. It made him feel a bit safer than he already does. Meanwhile, Nito enjoyed the fact that Izuku wasn't a messy roommate, and they were close. They still fought because what family doesn't? Usually their fights end with Nito licking Izuku's arm or leg in order to escape the hold he has on him. Izuku always let go. Nito always laughed in victory. Izuku smiled as he grabbed his clothes and went into the bathroom to get ready. Nito had his own routine that happened after Izuku's. Thoughts of what Mirai or Chimiko would make for breakfast came to his head as he showered and later dried off to get dressed. Once he was dressed and ready, he left the bathroom and finished by putting his hair into a tight bun, but pulled out enough hair to cover his golden eye. He could at least make it harder to be recognized. By the time he was double-checking his bag, Nito finally got up and disappeared into the bathroom. Izuku moved to the kitchen, where he saw Chimiko placing plates of pancakes down. He quickly took his seat, making her chuckle. "You're all revved up, aren't ya?" Izuku nodded. When he first met Chimiko, her country accent had surprised him. Plus, given that Nito didn't have one, it confused him a lot. Then he heard what had happened. While Nito was in the city at school, Chimiko was taking any and all offered work at nearby farms and ranches. She picked up the accent simply because it fit her new lifestyle more than a city accent. Mirai and him were still learning what certain phases meant. "I gotta leave early in order to help US set up. See ya in the exams, kiddo." She put a hand on his head and kissed his forehead. "Mirai will be taking you too. You boys will knock those others off their feet." With that, she left the house. Izuku quickly ate his share and made sure there was plenty left before going to the backyard and whistling. A few seconds later, a mass of golden fur ran over, 4 smaller masses running after her, and a couple of seconds after that, a large gray mass came running down the pathway towards him. Izuku happily knelt down and let Buttercup lick his face, smiling happily while keeping his mouth closed tight. Chimiko had gotten a new dog, a pit bull. They had been pretty good at keeping them separated before getting the pit fixed. But he got out one day, and now they had 4 puppies. When Chimiko asked why they never fixed Buttercup, Mirai explained that it had never crossed his mind to do it. Izuku ran his fingers through Buttercup's fur as he stood up, eventually patting her sides. "Hey, Big Mama, are you still being a good mama?" Buttercup rolled onto her back and pawed at him. "Good girl." He rubbed her belly. He felt the pit bull lightly tug at his sleeves. "Hello, you giant baby." His hands cupped the dog's face, and it tried to lick him. Izuku looked out the car window as Mirai drove him and Nito to Ua a few hours after Chimiko had left. He was lost in thought as the farms and fields slowly were replaced by townhouses, and later city buildings. What if he wasn't good enough for Ua? What if he doesn't get accepted because Chimiko is his stepmother? What if people thought he only got in because of Chimiko? What if his father saw him attending? Would he attack the school? "No," Mirai's voice cut through Izuku's thoughts like a knife. "Your father is abusive, but he's not an idiot. He knows when to pick and choose his battles. Why do you think he takes 2 years to plan each kidnapping attempt?" "How'd you know what I was thinking?" Izuku looked at Mirai from the back seat. Nito looked back at him. "You were thinking aloud again, you overthinking dork." Nito smiled as he verbally jabbed at Izuku. "At least I don't have to rely on those around me for my quirk." Izuku looked down at his phone, and a smirk came over his face when he heard the foe-offended gasp. That was below the belt. Izuku stuck his tongue out at his step-sibling. Mirai tried to block out the rest of their fighting as he focused on driving, hoping it ended soon. When they parked in front of the gate, both boys got out, and Izuku faltered once more before being tugged forward by Nito by the arm, kicking Izuku's legs into walking finally. Both boys paused when they saw Ijiru trip over his own feet and almost faceplant, being saved by a female student who tapped his shoulder. The raven-haired teen immediately freaked out at floating mid-air. Izuku got his arm free from Nito's grip and took a running start. The brunette squeaked and jolted backwards when a blur of green hair tackled the boy who she just saved from face-planting. She heard laughter and smiled, kneeling lightly to look at the boys. Both stood up straight, and she released her quirk. "Are you two friends?" Both boys looked at her. Ochako's eyes widened at the boy with green hair. He looked so serious. She turned her attention back to both boys. "Yeah, since we were toddlers. We grew up together." The green-haired boy smiled as his friend spoke. "My name is Kirishima Ijiru." The raven-haired boy, Ijiru, held out a hand. Ochako shook it. Uraraka Ochako. She turned and reached a hand out to the green-haired boy, who now had a blonde standing next to him. And you? Sasaki Izuku. He didn't even move his hand to shake hers, so she drew it back. Ochako turned to the blonde. Monoma Nito. Monoma wrapped an arm around Sasaki's neck. And this is my brother-cousin. My aunt married his dad and my aunt raised me. Legally, we're cousins, but we're more like brothers. She nodded. Out of my way extras. A spiked-haired blonde pushed the group apart. Monoma pulled Sasaki behind him and Kirishima glared at the back of the boy. Ochako frowned. Well, that was rude. Ochako and Ijiru spoke at the same time. Both looked at each other before chuckling. We should probably get inside before the tests start. Good idea. Izuku reached his arms above his head as he stretched. They had just finished the written part of their test. Now they wait for the heroics test. Kiri was changing to a shirt that he was fine ripping up and Uraraka was somewhere else. Must have had a different testing room. Izuku, Ijiru. A familiar voice called out and a familiar noise filled Izuku's ears. Ida's running. Both boys looked up. You should focus on getting ready for the test. We are, you robot. Nito teased from his spot on the wall behind Izuku. A grin on his face. The Ida immediately started to scold and admonish the blonde. Izuku just snorted and went back to his stretches. And Izuku, why are you covering your eye? Izuku froze. That seems like it, shut it. It's a coping thing. Nito hissed through gritted teeth. Plus it helps keep him from getting recognized. Tenya frowned and bit his tongue. He didn't realize this was the first time he'd seen Izuku do it. The bun was common due to the length and amount of hair Izuku had, but covering up one eye? That was new. Though he overheard Murai and Tensei talking about how Izuku had a breakdown about his looks. He didn't hear the full story, but the first time he saw Izuku with his hands wrapped up in bandages was terrifying. Izawa let out a noise as Chimiko happily stood next to him, leaning onto the wall. She'd become a little sister to him, though he'd never admit it. She knew when to be serious and when to show her emotions. Plus her dark sense of humor matched his own. Hey Nedzu, her voice rang out in the dark room. Neither of them could see the principal move at all due to the height of the chairback. Yes, Kai? His voice matched her own. Will I be able to tell my boys their test results early? Aizawa pondered that as well. Would he have been able to tell Izuku if he passed or not? After we send out the letters, you can bring their letters to them personally. The blonde smiled and turned her attention to the screens of the tests. Will I have a first-year homeroom this year? Yes, one of the hero classes. Nedzu's pen clicked. Wonder who I'll have. Shouta nodded. Izuku felt metal under his hand and let his quirk go off at random. The resulting overhaul made the metal twist and bend, wires crossed and broke, and wheels became fused together. Izuku saw the large 3 and smiled, quickly running over to a 2-pointer and slamming both hands onto it. It became a ball, and he felt one for all crackle under his skin as he kicked the ball into a 3-pointer. He hissed and quickly slapped his leg. The pain of a broken bone quickly faded, and he continued to try and pass. He didn't have any friends in the area. Uraraka was in here, but he wasn't going to mess with her focus. Kirishima seems to know his strength, using his quirk to be hard enough to pierce the metal. Chimiko was by the other teachers, using the back of Nedzu's chair as a support to lean on. And then there's Kaminari, giving them just enough of an electric shock to fry their circuits. Now I see why Nedzu has you watch these tapes. You can make those guesses just off seeing them go. Midnight smiled. Well, I am the quirk analysis teacher here. Of course I'm good at my job. Chimiko looked at the screen that flashed to show Izuku sliding on the ground. The 2-pointer he slid under breaking apart at the seams right afterwards. The green-haired one seems to have been trained. Present Mike said, looking over at Shouta. You have Aizawa to thank for that. All Might spoke up. Plus any training Naita gave him. Oh, he knows that. Chimiko grinned. He's just being a tease. All Might looked down at his feet. He didn't fit in here. Everyone else was friends with each other. Everyone went silent for a bit. Seems no one in Area A will be able to pass with villain points. Bakugo is taking out all of the robots. Chimiko broke the silence, her brows furrowed. I think we should probably keep an eye on him. He seems easy to piss off. Nedzu nodded as he reached towards a button on the console. Well, I think it's time for the finale. tilde tilde. Izuku's chest was tight as he took a break, itching his wrist lightly. He was trying to catch his breath. Why did he have to run so much? Why didn't he jog? He threw his head back and looked at the sky before feeling the ground start to shake under his feet. Was there an earthquake? He had to get away from buildings, just in case. Wires snapping caught his attention, and he turned to the noise, watching students run past him in fear. Wide eyes stared at the monstrosity that was the 0-pointer. Why was it huge? Izuku turned to run, deciding it wasn't worth it when he heard a small voice. He quickly turned to the noise and froze. Uraraka was stuck in the rumble, about to be run over by the robot. She looked in pain too, and the time limit began. Izuku grabbed a student and turned them to face him, pointing at Uraraka. Save her, he let go. I'll buy you some time. With one foot slamming down, several spikes shot out in front of him and impaled the 0-pointer. It kept coming. One for all flickered again. Izuku ran and jumped, hoping for a minor break instead of having his legs mangled by the quirk. He pulled a hand back and punched the giant in the face. He felt the bones in his hands shatter like glass. The pain in his legs made themselves known, and within seconds, Izuku was in free fall towards the ground. All Might jolted when he heard the scream rip out of Chimiko's throat. All the staff did. They heard the students in the same area scream as well, believing they were about to see someone die. Izuku felt like his arm and legs were on fire. His eyes began to water, and he held his arm to his chest on instinct, as the wind whipped his hair around his face and ears. A sharp pain filled his cheek as well as hives. A few seconds later, he was floating a few seconds above the ground. Release. He looked at the voice, seeing it was Uraraka, her hands pressed together, only to immediately groan in pain when he fell to the ground onto his back, and his already mangled leg. He heard her vomit and cringed. A shaky hand reached for his arm, and he overhauled it, quickly fixing it. He reached down for his legs and did the same, slowly moving the one under him to a better position. Thank you, Uraraka. The girl weakly smiled before vomiting again. Izuku still felt the sting of the slap on his cheek as he stayed on the ground. She'd saved his life by slapping him across the face. What even is her quirk? He reached up as the hives began to spread down his neck. He covered them with a hand and sat up. Tilde Shouta watched Chimiko slide down to her knees, holding her chest tightly. He wasn't too far behind her, ready to hold her up if needed. Nezu was trying to talk to her, but it was falling on deaf ears. Who could blame her? She just believed she was about to watch her stepson plummet to his death. President Mike called out the end of the tests and Recovery Girl started her rounds. Chimiko practically bolted out of the room. All Might was certain she used a speed quirk as she darted out of the room at top speeds. Tilde Nito chuckled as Izuku stayed in Chimiko's hold. The boy was hugging back. You scared me so bad. Chimiko's voice shook, and she ran a shaking hand over his head. Izuku was certain it would have been in his hair had it not been in a bun. I scared myself. Izuku hid his face as he felt the hives demanding to be itched. Can I have some wipes? Chimiko gave him some, and he quickly wiped his face and neck. Izuku heard Kiri's voice before he saw the raven-haired boy. He smiled when he ran up. Tenya wasn't far behind. Do you know if Momo is here? Recommendation students have their tests tomorrow, so no, she's not here today. The boys made a small noise of sadness before they began to talk about their exams. Chimiko told them that she can't tell them their results. She felt a hand tap her shoulder, and she looked over it. Oh, it's you. The smile on the blonde's face immediately disappeared. Boys, I'll be right back. Stay here. All Might gulped in fear when she turned and walked him away from the boys. You have a 5-second head start before I track you down and break your arm and legs. I just wanted to say, All Might started, backing up. I definitely see why Nezu had you as a personal student. 3 seconds. Chimiko held up 3 fingers. Don't think sucking up is going to. If you don't break my bones, I'll give you pictures of Izuku and Murray when he was my sidekick. That made the woman pause. She raised an eyebrow. What's the catch? Catch? All Might forced a laugh. Why would there? She glared at him. Okay, there is one. All Might pulled out his phone and showed it to her. I send you one any and every time Izuku breaks something, and you don't break my bones. Deal? The teacher in front of him thought before she held out a hand. Phone. Give. All Might handed it over. When he got it back, it showed that she added herself into his contact list. She was already walking towards the boys when she stopped. Oh, and Yagi, All Might flinched. She wasn't even looking at him. When she did though, it was soft and kind. Marie misses you, though he'd never admit it out loud. She smiled. Her eyes showed a small pinch of sadness in them. Do try to get back in touch, so you don't miss the next big thing in our lives. With that, she turned back and moved to her boys. Her nephew hugged her immediately and Izuku joined soon after. Then Ida and Kirishima after him. The woman was smiling all the while. Ijiru waved goodbye happily as he got into his mother's car. Tenya already left, and now it was just the Sasakis. You boys are staying with me until Mirai can come pick you up. Chimiko ruffled Nito's hair, who immediately pulled away and fixed it. Izuku chuckled. I have classes to teach and papers to grade, so you'll be staying in the teacher's lounge. Nedzu wants to talk to both of you. No peeking at your exam scores. Both boys nodded, and they walked into the building. Copycat. A familiar voice called out, and the three ducked as a blur of yellow flew over them and into the wall by them. Hello, Lemillion. Still trying to tackle me, I see. Izuku and Nito continued on the way to the office, knowing the way a little bit from the testing earlier, but mostly because Chimiko had shown them a map of the school when giving Izuku hiding places for panic attacks. I'll get you one day. Mirio sat up fully. Next time, don't announce yourself. Chimiko smiled at her husband's sidekick. He's always had a goal to try and tackle her since she first had him in her quirk analysis class this year. She'll miss his jokes during the next one. That was for Monoma and Sasaki. He laughed and smiled brightly. Speaking of whom, did they finish their exams already? He got up and onto his feet. Yes, Nedzu is now giving them a personal exam of his own. Chimiko nodded. Same one I took when I became his personal student. Ah, the memories. She cupped her cheek. I was so stressed at the time I forgot to put my name at the top, let alone write the date. Nedzu watched the two boys. Izuku was fully focused on his test and was reading everything, his dual-colored eyes scanning the pages. Nito was a different story. He had one hand digging into his hair and the other holding his pencil and test. One of his legs were bouncing. Izuku's legs started to bounce soon after. It seemed to help the two get out energy. Chimiko would just chew on her own hair and eventually cough up anything that got stuck in her throat, like a cat. Nedzu smiled as he thought. Izuku was more brains than muscle, the ninth holder of One for All, and he already had a good quirk. He had a lot going for him, even with his bio-family problems. Nito was dealt a bad hand in life, losing his parents at the age of 7, and then living with his aunt who was put under extreme amounts of stress. His personality was, strange to say the least, but it could be roughed out. Boys. Chimiko leaned back in her chair looking at the boys. Izuku looked up from his current quirk analysis journal, and Nito was on a beanbag napping. Mirai is here. Izuku shook Nito, who batted away Izuku's hands and rolled over. Let him sleep. I'll take him home when work ends. Izuku nodded and stood up, said goodbye to the teachers, and collected his things before leaving the building. Sure enough, Mirai was leaning onto his car, Mirio nearby. The two looked up and Izuku moved to a jog. He practically jumped into the car. Mirio smiled and hopped into the front seat, while Mirai got into the driver's seat and started on the way to the agency. So, Mirai started. How was the test? It was good. I lost count, but I think I'll pass at least. Oh, and someone got stuck, so me and another student saved her. Her name is Uraraka. Didn't get the other kid's name. Izuku rubbed his arm. It felt like something was out of place inside of it. Maybe he healed something wrong. And Nito? Izuku smiled. Wasn't in the same area, and I think he overused his quirk cause he's out like a light back in the teacher's lounge. He chuckled at the memory of the blonde practically face planting the beanbag in order to claim it before Izuku got to it. They still fought over it. I remember when you did that. Aizawa would just bring you home, and you were just limp. Mirai didn't turn away from watching the road. Thought you were paralyzed the first time it happened. He had the hint of mirth in his voice that got Izuku to smile. He'd learned how to tell Mirai's moods from living with him for so long, so it was easy to read him. Mirai peeked into Izuku's room at the agency and smiled at the sleeping teenagers on the beanbags. Izuku's jacket being used as a blanket and his face buried into the fabric. Nito was curled up on two, his backpack near his feet. He closed the door and felt the smile fade as he walked to his office. His wounds ached and Chimiko met him inside, a worried look. her quirk journal open on the desk next to her. Another attack, he nodded as he sat down and took his suit top off. He heard her hiss at the sight of the bruises and cuts decorating his back. Chisaki really wants you dead, doesn't he? He felt her hands connect with his back, and the healing quirk emitted from her fingertips. He relaxed with a pained groan. Yay. He watched the ground. After the forest incident, it's only gotten worse. She hummed and kept healing him. The wounds weren't necessarily healing. It was actually just reversing it, so it's like it never happened. It only worked on minor things, like bruises and shallow cuts. Deeper cuts required a different quirk mixed in with the one she's using. Even then, it wasn't like she could regrow lost organs or limbs. I don't think we should hide this from Izuku forever. Her hands touched an open wound and Murai hissed in pain. She quickly pulled away. Sorry. Anyway, we should tell him eventually. He deserves to think that he's a burden, Murai interrupted. You know him. The second he finds out that Chisaki has been trying to kill me for years, and that he's done more than trying to kidnap him every 2 years, Izuku would feel like a burden, and that we lied to him. He felt the last wound close up and sighed with relief as the pain finally began to fade away. Technically, it isn't a lie. Turn around. Murai listened to the command and shifted. And you know how he is with how secrets technically aren't lies. Chimiko smiled at Murai as she healed the bruises on his chest. I'm worried about how he'll react. He felt a hand cup his cheek, before the hand immediately slapped him. He quickly held the injured cheek. It didn't hurt much, and the pain quickly faded. Hey, Murai, I love you, but sometimes, you're an idiot. He felt her hold onto both sides of his face, and force him to look into her eyes. That big brain of yours is thinking too far ahead again. You need to focus on the present. Yes, Izuku will be mad at us, but he'll understand. He moved her hands off his face, holding them in his lap. He'll understand that we wanted to protect him, to give him the best childhood filled with love and excitement. Chimiko sat next to him, leaning onto his shoulder. A child didn't need to have his parents getting attacked weekly, sometimes daily, by an awful parent on their conscience. Izuku's just as smart as you. He'll know why we hid it for so long. A ghost of a smile graced Murai's face. He's a smart kid, just like his dad. And his mom. Murai wrapped an arm around Chimiko, who is sometimes annoying as hell, but she knows what to say and when to say it. She laughed and put her chin on his shoulder, her eyes closed happily. And how to say it? Murai chuckled. Don't get too ahead of yourself now. She immediately pulled away, faking anger. Hey, he smirked at his wife. Izuku felt the puppies attacking his shoes as he sat on the porch swing. A notebook in one hand and a pencil in the other. He let his shoelaces hang down for the pups to attack, while making sure he wouldn't accidentally kick one while swinging. He was drawing in his notebook, Buttercup's head on his thigh, using the swing to get away from motherhood for a while, and to also beg for attention. Izuku gave her attention whenever he wasn't shifting his feet, touching down to get another swing done, or drawing. He thought about what type of hero he wanted to be. If he was a pro hero, he'd be in the spotlight 24/7, and probably wouldn't be able to catch a break when needed. But underground isn't really his thing either. Sure, Aizawa-sensei talked about it, but it didn't have the same public figure role he wanted. He wanted to show kids that they could be heroes no matter what, even if their quirk is villainous and/or if they have at least one villain in their bloodline. He felt one for all burning inside of his chest. It was like a campfire in a sense, and using it was like throwing himself into that fire. Maybe he could find a way to jump though without getting burned. But how to? Izuku groaned when he realized he was writing his thoughts right over his hero costume sketch. He flipped to a new page and started all over. He hummed before remembering something he read about in a book he was reading earlier about symbolism. Owls were symbols of luck. He's been quite lucky his entire life outside of the Yakuza base's walls. He started to sketch out a cape that looked like owl wings, then a full-face mask of an owl. Could probably put night vision and heat vision in the mask too. He pulled his phone out for color symbolism and smile. He could be a snow owl. Plus, he likes to snowboard, so it could be an inside joke. Though he could never get a hang of ice skating despite Chimiko's many tries, just like how Nito never got a hang of snowboarding or skiing. He brought his feet up to the bench and placed them on the wooden seat, letting the breeze rock him. A stray strand of hair came into his vision, and he decided to add a headscarf that would keep his mess of curls out of his line of sight as much as possible. He got combat boots, then made the main outfit a black long sleeve with medium-length shorts. They could be tucked into his boots. He looked over the design and made a few changes here and there. But he eventually finished and went back inside. An army of puppies right on his heels. Izuku saw Chimiko enter the house first. Nito too wrapped up in their video game. I got your results, boys. Is Mirai home? Izuku nodded and pointed at the study. Chimiko left to bring him out while the boys paused. Mirai came out with her a few moments later and Chimiko handed them their letters. Here you go. Now who should open theirs first? Nito, Izuku said. He won the last round of Mortal Kombat. He pointed at the paused game on the screen. The blonde smiled and ripped open the package. A small disc landed on the coffee table and started playing upside down. Nito flipped it over quickly, greeted by the number 1 hero himself, All Might. The hero explained how hero and villain points worked and his score. Chimiko smiled at the part she knew was coming up. Congratulations, Monoma, you've made it into US Hero course. The video cut out and the blonde covered his face as he quickly went to his aunt and buried his face in her shoulder, her arms quickly wrapping around him. I gotcha. She rubbed his back, listened to his muffled voice as best she could. Yeah, you did it, you got in. She was smiling. Izuku, why don't you open yours? Izuku got the same disc, luckily right side up this time, and it started. All Might appeared again and gave a speech about heroism and risking one's life for another. A clip of his test playing on the screen. You also scored the highest in the exams, with 80 points in total. 44 villain points and 36 hero points. Welcome to US Heroics Program, young Sasaki. The video cut out and Izuku's eyes began to water. Both the boys started to cry. My babies. Chimiko hugged Nito tighter, while Murray wrapped his arms around Izuku. You boys did so well. You got in. Who knows, maybe you'll be in the same class. Murray felt Izuku's silent sobs, shaking his form and hugged tighter. Part of him wanted Izuku to start being vocal when crying, but he was okay with this. I got in. Izuku's voice was filled with joy. Nito threw wood onto the fire as the family of 4 sat around it, quickly grabbing his food and relaxing in a chair. Izuku was looking at the fire. One for all is kinda like a bonfire. Just throwing myself in will burn me. Aka break my bones. He turned the skewer in his hand to roast the other side. But just putting one limb in still sets me on fire. Chimiko hummed as she watched and thought. Murray tried to remember if All Might ever fully explained how it felt to use the quirk. Izuku's food caught on fire, and he pulled it out to blow it out. Chimiko made a noise before pulling out a marshmallow and holding it over the blaze, keeping it away from the flames. What if you just held the limb or stood near it? You'd still be warm, but you wouldn't catch fire so easily. Izuku nodded. It's a good place to start for now. The family went silent for a while, other than the dogs making noise as some of the pups began to fight. So I got my schedule today. Nito mentioned. Chimiko turned to him. I'm in 1B with Vlad King. I have Aizawa Sensei in 1A. Izuku started to eat. Murai's brows furrowed. Kai, didn't you say you were teaching a heroics class? The woman nodded. Yua only has 2 heroics classes. Not this year, she smiled. I managed to convince Nedzu to do an experimental 3rd class. So this year, support, gen ed, heroics, and business all have 3 classes each. The Foresight hero made a noise of acknowledgement and grabbed a drink from the cooler. I'm teaching 1C, the 3rd heroics class. She continued. I've already gotten my roster and the entrance exam videos for each one to get them kick-started on their quirk improvements. Course, I'm not going to hand feed them and only drop hints. What's the 2 students you think will be the hardest? Izuku started to make another skewer. Oh, that's easy. The blonde looked at her stepson. Inazuma Risaki and Kikuchi Kasai. They seem to be opposites. One has a plant-based quirk and the other makes fire. Only you can stop forest fires. Nito said using a deep voice. Laughter began soon after. Murai just shook his head and smiled. The boys were in their respective classes as everyone else started to enter, Chimiko having taken them with her when she went in. Tenya was the next to come in after Izuku. Kiri and a couple others came in a couple minutes later. Spiky, Izuku said as he and Tenya looked at Ijiru's new hairstyle. The now redhead smiled. I know my mom's class roster, but not ours, so don't even ask. The smile on the green-haired boy's face spread to his friends. Izu, Tenya, Iji. A voice called out and arms wrapped around all three. One student in the back started yelling about luck. Izuku looked up at Momo and laughed. "We're in the same class." "We are." Tenya straightened himself out. "We are very lucky for it." The group nodded as they talked as more students filed in. That or Sasaki-sensei helped put the roster together. Ijiru put his bag in a chair. Izuku chuckled and leaned on his desk. "Maybe it was Aizawa-sensei," Momo suggested. "Also, I love your hair, Ijiru. Very you." The redhead smiled wide. A figure came up to the desk Izuku was sitting at. "Oi, bush head." Izuku looked up at the figure before flinching badly. Invisible hives spread throughout his entire body. "Oi, Deku." A 6-year-old kept running around the playground, only to be tackled by a blonde and mud shoved into his face. The green-haired boy started to push against the blonde on top of him, while keeping his mouth and eyes shut tight. "Eat it," Izuku shook his head. "Do it, nerd." 2 other kids came over and grabbed the green-haired boy's arms. The 3 rushed to a trash can and pushed the small boy head first into it, then held the lid closed as they heard bangs on the metal. Izuku sank into his seat as his friends listened, starting to notice Izuku's fear. Red eyes scanned him over. "I've seen you before?" Ijiru was the first to speak. "Yeah, you called us extras at the entrance exam." He stepped in front of Izuku's desk, in between the two. "And that wasn't manly." Bakugo glared at the redhead. He hasn't seen him before, but the green-haired kid looked way too familiar. Could it possibly be Ryozo? No, Ryozo wasn't good enough for Yua anymore. Besides, Ryozo moved away after they were 7. Right. "Hello, Aizawa-sensei." The green-haired kid spoke quickly. The raven-haired adult in the doorway looked at him. "Don't expect special treatment just because you're in my class, Sasaki." He stood up and left the yellow sleeping bag around him. "If anything, I'll be harder on you than the rest since I've dealt with you before." The class exploded. All eyes went on Izuku, who sunk in his seat more as people tried to figure out what their teacher meant. Aizawa regretted saying that. Red eyes flashed and black hair rose like the tail of a scared cat. "Enough." He stepped out of the bag and held up gym uniforms. "Put these on and meet me outside. You all have 10 minutes. Izuku." Aizawa looked at the boy, who quickly straightened. "You scored first in the entrance exams, so you'll be demonstrating one of the many tests we'll be doing." His student came towards him in a slight jog and stopped 2 feet back. He dropped a ball into the boy's hand. "Launch it as far as you can. Use your quirk. Stay in the circle." The boy nodded and moved to it, then stopped to think. He could take the stuffing out. No, then it'd be harder to throw. Izuku didn't notice that he was starting to mumble. He stopped and decided on what to do. With a wind-up, he threw the ball while powering his hand up with one for all. The wind picked up as he quickly grabbed his empty hand and healed the shattered bones without even opening his skin to look. Aizawa nodded. So he's gotten more control, but definitely not a lot if the healing was still needed. Hopefully Chimiko and him were getting close to a solution. Bakugo gulped slightly. Definitely wasn't Ryozo. Ryozo didn't have super strength. Izuku listened to Aizawa talk as he double-checked his healing on his hand when Uraraka said something that made him flinch. "This looks like it'll be so fun." Izuku slapped his hand to his face and then dragged it down. "That fool." "Fun?" Aizawa started. "So you think heroics is fun?" Uraraka tried to backtrack. "The student that places last in the exams," Izuku looked over to watch the incoming reactions, "will be expelled." The immediate outcry made a small smile appear on his face. "That's so unfair," Uraraka whined. Izuku walked to the group and put his hands in his pockets. Aizawa raised his head. "Oh, so I suppose natural disasters and mass casualty events are fair?" She balked. "The world is unfair," Izuku whispered. His friend's eyes flickered to him. The exams began and Izuku was up against Uraraka in the 50-meter dash. She was tapping her clothes and shoes. Izuku pulled his sneakers off and threw them off to the side with the socks. No need to ruin new shoes. The girl gave him a strange look as he crouched down and dug his fingers into the ground, his feet slowly lifting off. As soon as they were given the go-ahead, black lines shot through the ground and Izuku was pushed through the course quickly by a block of hardened earth, and he quickly moved to land feet first one across the line. He skidded a little bit while the earth pillar returned to normal. He dusted his hands off by hitting them against each other and walked back to the line, picking his shoes up on the way. Red eyes stared at him in confusion. Next was the grip strength, and Izuku watched as one of the shortest members of the class was talking to the tallest. Wonder what they were saying. He looked towards his friends as they squeezed as hard as they could. Izuku held the back of his head as he walked around a little after the final test, which was a long-distance run. All that barefoot running exercises Aizawa put him through back in the gym now made sense. He saw Ijiru come up to him. "How come you're not sitting? It's not good for your health to just suddenly stop moving after exercising a lot. You have to cool your body down." The redhead chuckled and shook his head. Always the health nut. Soon everyone gathered at the small stand, and Aizawa showed a screen of students and their places in the test. He closed it a bit later. "And I lied about expelling anyone." The class went silent. Shouta smiled under his capture weapon. "That was just a logical ruse to make sure you all gave it your all." The class erupted into yells of anger and relief. Izuku started to laugh. The capture weapon that wrapped itself around his arms just made him laugh harder. Aizawa entered the teacher's lounge to Chimiko, having her head down on the desk. Present Mike seemed to be laughing, and Midnight was desperately trying not to wheeze. What did I miss?" The blonde woman looked at him. "Inazuma Risaki and Kikuchi Kasai." She stood up. "They're both insane and fuel each other's insanity." She literally wrapped a vine around his waist and used him like a flamethrower in the entrance exam. "The entrance exam," Midnight chuckled. "That's not even the best part." The two immediately started talking with one another the second they realized they were in the same class. Chimiko's hair fell out of its bun as she ran a hand through her hair. "They're friends already. Seems like you have your own problem children." The blonde glared at him and crossed her arms. "Oh yeah? How many students did you expel just today?" Aizawa smiled at her smug look. Maybe deciding not to expel anyone was worth it. 0. The teacher's lounge exploded in on itself as Chimiko gave a look of heavy confusion. Izuku walked to lunch with Buttercup right next to him. Her vest on with big white letters saying "Don't pet me, I'm working." She found her way under the table Izuku sat at and laid down at his feet, her head resting on one of them. He smiled and reached down to lightly pet her. A few students looked at her as they passed, but most didn't have to be told not to pet her. Uraraka headed to said table with her tray in hand, only to pause at the unfamiliar student there, a tall boy with short blonde hair. She saw Kirishima wave her over, and she sat down, making sure she didn't get Buttercup's tail underfoot. "So who's this?" the brunette asked as she stirred her sauce into the rice. The blonde smiled. "I'm Tagata Mirio, also known as Lemillion." He posed, almost knocking over his drink. "I work for Sasaki's dad as a sidekick. Though it's only been 1 year, and I still have a lot to learn from Sir Nightai." "Your dad is Sir Nightai." Uraraka turned to Izuku, who groaned. "Sore subject." "No, just don't like the attention it causes whenever you hear someone's the kid of a hero." Izuku held up his hands. "Plus, I don't like talking about my parents cause my mom is a teacher here, but I can't exactly say that without at least one person saying I only got in because of her." "Well, your parents' jobs are a secret I'll keep." Izuku only hummed and turned back to his meal, causing her to frown. Tenya looked at Ochako. "Izuku is a very private person regardless. I've known him since we were children. Same goes for Ijiru and Momo." The brunette nodded. "Me, Momo, and Izuku went to a private academy. Remember when I broke my nose on that doorway?" Momo said, smiling. "My parents were about to pull me out, but I managed to convince them that accidents happen." Ijiru chuckled. "I do. You sounded weird for months while it healed even with a splint in place." "I'm still a little jealous that Ida and Kirishima can have physical contact with Sasaki without issues," Mirio interjected. "But I'm getting to that level of trust, right?" "Nope," Sasaki said with a straight face. "Oh, really?" Mirio laughed, knowing it was a joke. "What do you mean?" Ochako looked at the green-haired teen in confusion. He looked back at her, and she could have sworn she saw his hidden eye. "I have phobias that make it hard for me to touch people or be touched by those I don't know very well. It's getting better as I get older." He hugged Ijiru, showed that he didn't have any sort of mark, and then pat Mirio's hand. "The other one is germophobia." He showed the hives popping up on his hand, quickly cleaning it off. "So it goes hand in hand with the people touching." The brunette frowned. "That must be hard to live with. So what do you do to stop it?" "Clean the hand, know the person, etc., etc." He went back to eating. Izuku watched the front of the classroom. It wasn't like Aizawa to be late. I am here. But it was like All Might to be. Coming through the door like a normal person. That wasn't normal. Izuku made a face that was a mixture of admiration and an endless tiredness. He stared as All Might walked inside the classroom in the weirdest way possible. The number 1 hero announced that he was taking over hero training for the year and announced the day's training. 2v2 combat training. Izuku gave a puzzled look. Shouldn't they learn other stuff first? But he had no room for questions while everyone got their costumes, and he reluctantly grabbed his own, following the others into the locker room. Tilde. Izuku adjusted his mask and looked at himself in the mirror. His cape reached to the back of his knees and was supposed to be flame resistant, but technically could be set on fire if someone was that determined. His clothes were also slash-proof, meaning he wouldn't have to worry about someone with a knife, unless they stabbed him. But that's a problem for future Izuku. He laced up his combat boots and tested out the false bottoms, feeling the latch undo and his foot shove through the bottom. His socks were probably going to be a hurdle to get over. He fixed the latch and lightly hopped as he straightened his boots and went to the site the class was going to be held at. Moving the straps of the mask to be under the headscarf, Izuku looked for his friends. He caught sight of Ijiru first, walking over fairly quickly. His red-headed friend wasn't wearing a shirt at all. There was what looked like big gears on his shoulders that covered some straps that connected to his belt and pants. Maybe the gears acted as support for them. He was wearing baggy pants and his belt seemed like it had stuff in it. Maybe medical supplies. He saw Ig realize it was him and met him halfway, dragging a suit of armor behind him. You cold, Ig? Izuku raised a brow. The red shook his head. Is the mask supposed to look like that? The suit of armor spoke. It looks a little bit too small. Izuku nodded. Yeah, he folded his arms in front of his chest. I'll probably wait for it to break or something and redraw a new design in the meantime. The straps dig into my head, so those are definitely not staying. The three chuckled. Izuku then felt a tap on his shoulder and looked over. Momo was behind him. Izuku looked her up and down as he looked at her hero costume. Nice and open for maximum skin for creation. The raven-haired girl nodded. And what looks like a couple of books for ideas. You can get all that from just one look over? Kiri asked with a mirth laced within his voice. Izuku was about to say something, but All Might called attention to himself and began to explain the lesson. He revealed 2 boxes and pulled 1 ball from each. Numbers were written on them. Izuku listened as the teams were read out. Tenya and Jiru as the heroes against the villains Kuda and Shaoji. Heroes Ijiru and Satu versus villains Uraraka and Kaminari. Tokoyami and Hagakura are against Asui and Shiro. Mainta and Shoto are fighting Ashido and Ojiro. Izuku was working with Momo against Bakugo and Aoyama. Izuku waved his friend off as he walked with the rest of the class to the viewing area. Not noticing the red eyes staring at him, Tenya turned to Jiru as they waited outside the building. So what's your quirk? These. Jiru held out her earphone jacks attached to her ears. I can plug it into a wall and hear what's happening or plug them into the speakers on my boots to make loud noises. What's yours? I have engines in my legs, letting me run fast, in simple terms. Tenya watched the purple-haired girl think for a moment before she snapped her fingers. I have a plan. Great, he hasn't got one yet. How loud can your engines get? What? Tilde. Shoji frowned at the silence, pressing an ear to the wall. Kuda gave him a strange look from his spot in the room, watching the windows. Then the faintest sound of a door opening got the bulky teenager to focus, only for a sudden loud engine to roar through the building, causing him to quickly pull away out of pain from the suddenness of it. Tenya mentally thanked Tensei for the shoe recommendation as he raced up the stairs. Jiru was taking the fire escape up, and he needed to draw attention to him and not her. He reached the proper floor and looked for signs of his classmates. His answer was a punch square in the jaw, causing him to stall, figuratively and literally. His engines stopped as he processed what happened before he restarted them, and rushed the larger male. Buy her time to either take out Kuda and then help with Shoji, or if the bomb is where she thinks it is, touch the bomb. Jiru slowly entered the room via the window, looking around for her classmate when she saw him. He was staring out the door with his back to her. She saw the bomb and quickly laid a land on it. All Might's voice rang out in their ears. Heroes win. Tilde Jiru walked into the room and saw the kid who was dressed as a owl fist Bumpita. Maybe they were friends. They were hanging out after school yesterday. She walked over to Kuda and Shaoji, holding a hand out. Shoji shook it. Good round. I wasn't expecting you to go around the back. I was wondering why he was being so loud though. Shoji chuckled before she could respond. Jiro turned to Kuta, who used JSL to say, good round. She responded back in JSL saying, thank you. His eyes lit up, like he wasn't expecting her to know it. Tilda, so how should we do this? Uraraka turned to the blonde next to her. He rubbed the back of his neck as he looked at the bomb. I could try to shock them, but I'd probably get you if I do a wide-range attack. The brunette stared at it well. Hey, did All Might say the bomb had to stay inside the building? The blonde looked at her, right as she tapped the bomb and made it float. His eyes widened. No, I don't think he did. Both teenagers smiled. Tilda, heroes are entering. Ijiru tested the door to see if it was locked. It wasn't, and they split up to cover as much ground. They opened doors, and if they were locked, they busted it down. They couldn't find any sign of the bomb or of the villains. It wasn't until they got to the roof that they figured out why. The bomb was floating in the air, and both villains had plenty of time to prepare for them. They shared a look before accepting the losing battle and forfeited. Denki and Ochako high-fived, resulting in Denki floating for a couple seconds before he quickly dropped back to Earth, along with the bomb crashing onto the Fuax Street. Villains win. Luckily, we have a couple bombs in case of this. Ochako shyly shrugged. Kiri chuckled and gave her a thumbs up. Tilda Zero set up a bunch of tape in the room. Asui made sure the windows were locked. A few moments later, a bunch of tape wrapped around an invisible body, like a spider web catching a fly. Zero finished the wrap and placed the trapped Hagakura, only to hear Asui yelp as a dark and shadowy hand pushed through the tape and grabbed the bomb. Heroes won. Zero helped unwrap Hagakura. Tilda, stay here. Mainta looked towards the dual-colored student. Hell no. He wasn't going to let him take all the credit. He rushed through the door, and then immediately slipped on the forming ice, spreading through the building rapidly and slammed face first into a wall. Ashido quickly melted the ice trying to climb up her legs before a cold hand touched her back. It felt like someone dumped ice cubes down the back of her shirt. She was quickly overtaken by the ice and cold, and watched as Ojiro suffered the same fate. Villains won. Tilda, do you have your suppressants? All Might whispered to Izuku during the round. He smiled at the boy's nod before calling the match. He watched as he left with the heroes leaving shortly after Tilda Izuku looked around the room. Bakugo had an explosion quirk, so he'd easily be able to break down the door. So we need to reinforce everything. Momo jolted beside him. What? She stared at him confused. Was he thinking out loud? Can you make reinforced steel? Dual-colored eyes stared at gray ones from behind a mask. Got it. She opened her book and flipped a few pages. Bakugo stared at the ground. Was that really Araki? Was it a fake name? Why did he lie? Why was his quirk better now? He was supposed to be the only one in the stupid town to get into UA. So why was he here? Heroes can enter now. Bakugo stomped his way in. Any closed door immediately was kicked in as he went up the stairs. It was on the top floor when he felt waves of pain rush up his leg as his foot connected with metal. He smiled wide as he held a hand towards the door. Bingo. Izuku heard the explosion on the other side of the door and braced, only to immediately get ready to move. He tackled Momo, and she squawked like a bird just as the door was blown off its hinges, nearly hitting her. And the bomb. A laser burst through the ceiling above their heads. Izuku threw a wave of cement at Bakugo. Momo jabbed his staff through the new hole in the ceiling. Izuku shared a look with Momo and nodded to her. A blast shield popped out of Momo's back as she tucked and rolled out of the way, Ioma following her to the hallway. Izuku saw the blonde leap at him. Hands grabbed the cape, and he immediately unlatched it. A growl was given in return, as well as a war cry. Tilda. All Might watched the battle happening with the other students. Izuku was mainly using defensive moves, keeping Bakugo away from him and away from the bomb. Momo was dealing with Ioma in the hallway. That's when he saw it. He quickly grabbed the mic. Bakugo, do not use that attack inside a building. Shut up, old man. All Might ripped the earpiece out when the bang and ringing screamed into his ear. Tilda. Izuku let his cement shield fall apart as the noise quieted down. He looked behind to see a hole in the wall, and the bomb was just gone. He gulped, then felt a sharp pain in his jaw when a large gauntlet back handed him. Memories flooded in after the pain. Heroes lose. Izuku yelped when he saw his father throw the used gauntlet to the side and tried to tackle him. He rolled to the side and jumped onto his feet. He ran into a wall and held his hands out. What was he doing? Kai rushed him in a blind rage, so he grabbed his arm and twisted to push him away. Only for his quirk to activate out of panic, Izuku's heart stopped. Bakugo fell to the ground like someone just cut a puppet strings. The illusion of his father covering Bakugo faded as well. You killed him, Izuku. Izuku screamed as Momo ran over. Aijuru ran out the room, leaving Wana confused and worried. Why was Izuku screaming? What happened? Ida bolted out of the room yelling, Sasaki-sensei, Aizawa-sensei. All Might gulped as he tried to process what had happened. Then his mind kicked into gear. Healers, they need healers. He rushed from the room to get Recovery Girl there as fast as possible. Ig slid into the room, seeing Momo performing CPR on Bakugo before he locked eyes on Izuku. His hands were mixed into the ever-changing walls as he death gripped them. Ig couldn't read his face, but grabbed his shoulders. Do you have your suppressants? The slight nod was the only answer he got. He rummaged through the packs on his friend's hips before he found the enclosed needle. He jammed it into Izuku's leg like it was an EpiPen, then watched the lines that were covering the building like a virus slowly fade away as his hands came free, and he fell forward. Bakugo took a deep breath suddenly and coughed up a storm, only to be immediately punched in the face by Momo, who got up and helped Kiri carry the now unconscious Izuku to the exit. Aizawa met them and took him. Bakugo held his nose before he saw Recovery Girl look at him. Her cane made his head hurt more. Are you stupid? Tenya slowly opened the classroom door for everyone before pausing. Izuku was sitting on the floor, on his jacket, rubbing his hands into Buttercup's fur. He was tracing the gray fur starting to form around her muzzle. Momo and Kiri walked over and sat down next to him. Tenya acted as a bouncer, keeping everyone out of his friend's bubble. The door opened to a teacher and a blonde. The blonde joined the sitting next to Izuku, while Vlad King looked at the class. This is Monomanito. He'll be swapping places with Bakugo after this incident. Aizawa entered Nedzu's office with a flash drive, and immediately felt on edge. He looked towards the source. Sir Nightai and Copycat were sitting across from Mrs. and Mr. Bakugo, their son in between them. He showed them the clip of the battle, and pointed out what was wrong and why they were there. Then promptly sat down to watch the bonfire. So you see why you were called in today on such short notice. Nedzu began. He offered tea to everyone, but no one took any. Young Bakugo here attacked a classmate even after the training exercise was finished, and was told not to use a certain attack inside. He wasn't giving his all, and Bakugo suddenly felt like his voice was ripped out of his throat. Chimiko stood up, her face dark. Because he's still learning how to control his quirk. She leaned towards him. You're lucky he only stopped your heart and not paralyzed you from the neck down. The blonde sat down and his voice returned. You need to learn how to control that anger, or you'll never be a hero. Bakugo jolted. Hey, his mother began, her voice raising. Sasaki-sensei is correct. Nedzu interjected. While her wording could have been better, I'll excuse it since her son was the victim here. Continuing off of that. Nightai, Copycat. What shall we do to fix this? Suspension and anger management classes for the boy. And for his parents, a parenting class, marriage counseling and anger management. Those are my terms for me not to press charges against Katsuki here. Chimiko folded her arms. Nightai nodded. He had already agreed on her terms on the car ride over. Mitsuki scowled. And if we refuse? I don't need to look into the future to know you'd never win that court case. And that your son would be banned from every hero school in the country. Nightai responded. 2 heroes suing a pair of parents because their child's life was in danger. The media would descend upon that story like the vultures they are. I shall monitor the deal, and will be switching Bakugo to 1B to avoid these types of things happening as easily. Why does he have to move? Move the other boy. Unfortunately, young Sasaki has a supportive friend group in 1A, and the teacher there is well versed in his quirk. So it'd be much harder to move 4 students, train a teacher, and such. So moving just Bakugo is better. Nedzu sipped his tea. It's fine, 1A and 1B are practically the same class anyway. Masaru answered and forced his son to bow in sync with him. I apologize for this all. Young Bakugo will be suspended for 2 weeks. 1 for disobeying a teacher's orders, and 1 for attacking another student. The meeting wrapped up and Night Eye pat Chimiko's back as she made a strangling motion with her hands and let out a growl. I'm going to go punch one of the punching bags in the gym. She gritted her teeth. Text me what you want for dinner. She left. He watched her go, then headed the other way to go back to the agency, passing by All Might in the hallway, who was holding a slip of paper and rubbing his neck. I'm sorry. All Might's voice made him freeze.